Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous is easily my favorite CRPG. It's far from a perfect game. In fact, I would wholeheartedly agree that it can be absolute Eurojank at times, and it's definitely not for everyone. It is an incredibly inaccessible game in what is already considered to be an incredibly inaccessible genre, and that is in no small part due to the fact that the game is not balanced in the slightest. On a positive note, I honestly think it adds to the power fantasy. One of the game's main themes is whether the ends justify the means, and when the game starts with a demonic invasion utterly decimating the bastion that held for 100 years of crusades, knowing full well what your enemy is capable of and what is at stake makes ascending into a nearly godlike figure immensely satisfying. It honestly reminds me a lot of Morrowind in that regard. It's a fun game to break with a narrative that fully supports it. On the flip side, however, holy shit, this game can be ruthlessly punishing. Especially on the highest difficulties. Core is unforgiving to newer players who may be coming in with limited experience with the rule set, or even CRPGs in general, but really, as long as you use your kit to its fullest, you can make any team comp work out. Unfair, on the other hand, your introduction to the game is likely going to be your main tank charging into a few low-level centipedes, before you suddenly realize you've made a massive mistake when she gets hit for 3 times her maximum health. Yeah, the best way I can describe unfair Wrath of the Righteous is that it's an arms race between the player and the developers to see who can out-bullshit each other, where even being able to complete the game is a major achievement. And I mean that literally. Less than 1% of players have it, and any conversation about the difficulty online inevitably devolves into unfair becoming this deified mythical beast that devours players' hopes and dreams and leaves behind only empty husks, soulless shadows whose only remaining purpose is to warn others not to make the same mistakes they did. So let's do it perfectly. Effectively Hitless. Or effectively 1 HP. Except actually significantly worse than that, because we would otherwise be able to abuse significantly more systems that some would consider borderline mandatory for unfair. And of course we're doing it mostly solo. Okay, so let's make our character. As I said, this is mostly going to be a solo run for reasons that will be explained in more depth as time goes on, which means that skills are absolutely critical to us. Not only because passing skill checks is, fairly valuable in any RPG, but also because failing a skill check will regularly result in us taking damage. Whether that be failing a perception check and walking into a trap, or failing an athletics check and taking damage from a fall, or failing a persuasion check and getting into an otherwise avoidable encounter. With no party to evenly distribute skill points, and nat 20s not being a guaranteed success, we really need a class that wants as much intelligence as possible, as that allows us to take significantly more skills. And after a fair amount of time pondering which would be the best, I decided to run with a class I've never played before. A witch. More specifically, a Witch of the Veil. This may not be a surprise to some of you watching, as this archetype is somewhat infamous for being absolutely phenomenal in the early game, but I'm getting a bit ahead of myself here. As for race, human is our safest bet just because they start with an extra feat, as well as access to Fast Learner, which gives us an extra skill point per level, which, as I alluded to earlier, is going to be extremely helpful. For attributes, this is one of the only playthroughs in which Constitution is actually a viable dump stat, so we do have a lot of options available. But I eventually decided upon 10 Strength, 18 Dex, 7 Con, 19 Intelligence, 10 Wisdom, and 9 Charisma. So overall, very balanced. In retrospect, I probably would have added in some extra strength, but we do really want as much dexterity and intelligence as possible. Obviously, intelligence increases our spellcasting capabilities on top of the previously mentioned stat benefits. But dexterity is also important to prioritize because winning initiative is going to be crucial for long-term success, and AC is going to be great for reducing our odds of getting hit in life or death situations. Then for first two feats, I already mentioned Fast Learner, which we're obviously going to pick up, but there's another feat that is a bit of a strange choice, but I think is going to help us out immensely during the early game, which is access to an extra hex. Specifically Fortune. I'll get into that in just a minute, but moving on to our familiar, we're going to adopt a little bunny for extra initiative and perception. Similarly for our background, we picked up Pickpocket for yet even more initiative. Then on to spells, they're going to be pretty basic overall. Just a lot of buffs a la Mage Armor and Reduced Person. For our deity, I think Siren Ray is the optimal choice, as that has access to an extra dialogue option in Act 3, which grants an insane temporary buff that can allow you to snowball experience gains fairly easily. But for RP purposes, I'm gonna go with Rovagug because that's a bug. And as you may have noticed up here, I'm also playing as Bug. Or Buge, rather. I don't remember why exactly, but for my first playthrough of this game 3 years ago, I just made Buge, and since that playthrough, literally every character I've made since has been different variations of Buge. But I digress. Alignment doesn't matter too much for us, but Lawful Evil is fine. We made our dude look very, very gruff, and as for our voice, I mean, when I daydream about being able to talk to my adorable, clingy little puppy, this is exactly how I think he'd sound like.
Let's hear you cry! None shall escape! I am superior!
That being said, as much as this voice is optimal and is absolutely critical for the build's success, I do have a massive soft spot for the carefree voice option for women specifically. Maybe I'm simply just part of the problem, but committing genocide with a character that sounds like a 19-year-old chronically online Tumblr addict just makes me giggle.
A sweet smile, a gentle voice, and kind words will help me win their hearts. And if that fails, I'll use my sharp nails instead. Away, you rascal!
But with the paperwork done, we're off to the races. Fortunately, we avoided taking damage immediately because Featherfall was cast on us just before we fell into this harrowing chasm. But speaking of our fortune, let's discuss Fortune. So, Fortune is an ability that basically gives us advantage on any ability check, skill check, attack roll, or saving throw, meaning that instead of rolling 1 dice, we roll 2 and take the better result, which is obviously exceptional. Technically, it doesn't directly buff what our character is capable of, but realistically it makes the game so much more consistent. And at this level, this would normally only have a duration of 1 round. However, with Cackle, which we also picked up at level 1, we can extend this indefinitely. It is agonizingly slow, though. This would honestly be fine, as you don't need more than 15 to 20 minutes for most areas. However, we're going to be traveling a lot in this game, and travel times could range from anywhere between an hour at minimum to upwards of several days for longer journeys. And since you can only benefit from this spell once per long rest, and since spamming long rests is far from a viable solution due to abyssal corruption, we quickly start to run into problems actually utilizing the damn thing. But it wouldn't be difficult to make this last forever. It's totally possible to have this as a permanent buff for the rest of the playthrough from the second we start the game. All I'd have to do is leave the game running while I sleep and have an auto-clicker spam Cackle until the heat death of the universe, but I don't think either of us really care to do that. Especially since, again, this doesn't even strictly buff what our character is capable of. It's literally just bad luck protection. So for one of only 2 quality of life buffs I'm going to give myself in this playthrough, I just went ahead and toggled a toy box setting to make Cackle's duration increased exclusively outside of combat. Not even by a ludicrous degree, mind you. It's not like we're going to have a several month-long fortune buff giving us advantage for the rest of the playthrough, but trimming down what could realistically be an hour of spamming Cackle is going to be convenient. And I can't even make myself apologize about this decision because the only thing this does is save time. It's still annoying, but it's significantly less annoying. Anyways, with all that preamble out of the way, let's get into more preamble. In the difficulty settings, there's an option to limit experience gains to active companions, and this is going to be incredibly valuable for us. During the early game, you should always have the setting turned on because you literally cannot have 6 party members until the prologue is over, but that statement does come with a caveat. To help balance this out a little bit, companions you recruit aren't automatically converted to your level like they normally would be. That is, unless you're cheeky and intentionally min-max the system by toggling the modifier on and off just before you recruit any new companions. Which means that the early game is suddenly much less punishing because you're effectively multiplying the experience points you normally receive. And trust me when I say, the early game on Unfair is fucking painful, so we're going to want to take advantage of every system we can. But speaking of those companions, we went ahead and got our Resident Paladin, and then we immediately failed the challenge. Because you are required to recruit Camellia, and the literal second you recruit her, she instantaneously stabs herself. I don't really know why, but she does. She's just a quirky white girl, I guess. That being said, I feel like this goes without saying, but we're obviously not going to count any plot-mandated damage, nor are we going to count damage from characters we do not control, a la NPCs and summons. I would like to note the use of the word mandatory there. That will regularly come back to bite me in the ass later, but at least for now, Camellia can have a little self-harm as a treat. Considering her character, this is honestly on the lower echelons of degeneracy and debauchery for her. But speaking of uncontrollable characters, we also have Anevia, who despite being temporarily crippled from the considerable fall she just endured, will still carry us to victory like the Giga Chad she is because she's actually unkillable. This isn't common enough to make use of consistently, but there are quite a few friendly NPCs that are unable to die in combat. I'd imagine because attempting to ensure a character's survival when you can't control them or otherwise influence their decision making is never a great time in these games. However, this does leave room for exploitation, and although it's always unnecessary and can even be actively detrimental depending on the situation, by far the easiest and most consistent way to get past the first few combat encounters is to abuse this behavior as much as possible. Which, again, considering unfair, isn't insubstantial in the slightest. But after clearing through the first few packs of enemies, we meet our next 2 companions and level up. And this is where a really fun aspect of this playthrough is unlocked. In just a few minutes, we're going to be entering into the Shield Maze, and for those foolhardy enough to even attempt Unfair, this is where most playthroughs go to die. Unfair really starts to show its teeth here, with enemies that have comically inflated stats for their levels, and it isn't even strictly uncommon for your main tank to suddenly keel over and die, because they got hit for 70 to 80 damage when their maximum health is maybe 30 to 40 at most. Granted, for this playthrough that's irrelevant as all damage is treated equally, but regardless, these encounters are still immensely challenging, so we want to try and maximize our odds of success whenever possible. Which makes this a great time to mention that we will not be leveling up until we're out of the Shield Maze. Fortunately, our companions can, but I can't, and that's still pretty significant. When every point of damage matters for ending combat as quickly as possible, being down a quarter of your party is rough, so we're going to make some very suboptimal decisions for companions here, because they're going to have to hard carry me throughout the entirety of the prologue. And for this, we're going to turn our attention to our local spider, cat, mutant woman thing. Before going into the Shield Maze, you're given a choice between following her or following Lan. It's your pretty standard RPG affair of choosing the good companion versus choosing the evil companion. But of course, evil prevails overall, with Windlog making the final encounter of the prologue significantly easier. So we're gonna go with her. This also has the added benefit of being able to mutilate her build however we'd like, because this isn't actually the decision to lock her in as a permanent companion. So from a metagaming perspective, there isn't even a downside to this besides RP. Unfortunately, we're also going against Seela's progression, although I don't think that's as notable because most dedicated paladin builds tend to hit level 11 to 13 depending on the archetype, with the remaining levels being a complete mad lib. So, although she's going to make some very questionable decisions here, it's not all that bad. But finally, as for Camellia, I mean, Shaman is just really good for the early game, so her build will be mostly unscathed, actually. But to get into the levels themselves, currently, considering our circumstances, I believe that the best options for our two party members are Rowdy Rogue and Rowdy Rogue. Okay, most people tend to go for a level in Sohei Monk for Seela because animal companions are absolutely busted in this game. In fact, debatably the most optimal way to steamroll through everything with as little effort as possible is to simply doomstack super buffed animal companions. However, they're gonna be significantly less busted in this playthrough because of two reasons. Firstly, one of their best qualities is that they are completely expendable, which of course isn't applicable in this playthrough. Secondly, every animal companion in our party is another target we'll have to protect during combat. And to state it outright, this game loves to throw you directly into combat encounters with little to no opportunity to adequately prepare yourself. And in those situations, they quickly become a massive liability. So instead, we're going to build into pure hyper offense and abuse surprise rounds. If you begin an encounter through sneaky and devious means, you're given a free turn, which in tandem with the sheer offensive pressure provided by our Rowdy dip, is enough to carry us through the first few encounters and allows us to hit level 3 fairly early into the shield maze. And unlike our second level, we're actually going to diversify our builds quite a bit here. Firstly, Camellia. She's still a shaman. But now she's a shaman with Protective Luck enchant, which fortunately doesn't require much explanation. It's basically the same thing as Fortune and Cackle, but Protective Luck gives you advantage against all attacks you receive, which is extremely helpful. Of course, whenever possible, we want to avoid getting attacked, but that isn't always realistic, so the consistency provided by it is phenomenal. Especially when you consider nat 20s. Critical hits are easily the fastest way for a playthrough to abruptly end, and going from a 1 in 20 chance for us to instantaneously perish, to a much more reliable 1 in 400 chance is obviously exceptional. However, we can go a bit further beyond. By letting Seela become 33% Stigmatized Witch, we can stack Protective Luck. This is a rather well-known exploit? Okay, honestly, the Venn diagram between intentional design and exploit in Wrath the Righteous is basically a fucking circle, but hexes from shamans and hexes from witches both stack. So by taking Protective Luck through the extra hex feat and Cackle immediately afterwards, our odds of getting hit via a critical go down from 1 in 400 to a casual 1 in 8,000. Yeah, it's pretty good. However, there is a large asterisk next to that statement. In order for us to even get to those insane odds, we have to have at least 20 AC higher than the enemy's attack bonus, which, considering unfair stat inflation, isn't particularly easy. That being said, Windlog hasn't leveled up yet, so with our new tech, we're gonna make her a tank. Or rather, I should say we're going to give her a tank, because unlocking an animal companion is going to be far better than any defensive 1-level dip. This animal companion would normally be locked to level 1, since their level is directly tied to your level in the class that gave you the companion. However, by choosing the Boom Companion feat, we can go ahead and raise that up to level 3. and alongside a few other beneficial buffs, our newly adopted kitty can now effectively face tank the shield maze. At least for the most part. It does hard counter most martial enemies, but it is far from invincible. Of course, enemy spellcasters can entirely bypass the AC through spells like Magic Missile or Snowball, and there are still a few enemies with such a high base attack bonus that it's probable the Leopard will eventually take a hit over the course of several turns. But having an actual frontline character means that we can play much more aggressively and combat isn't as immediately swingy. But with this brigade of very dysfunctional misfits, we were able to reliably take on most mandatory encounters until all that was left was the boss encounter against Hosilla. And let me be the first to tell you, speaking from experience here, she is fucking brutal. At least she normally is, but since we chose to bring Windlog with us earlier, instead of her phase transition making her fight more difficult, it just results in her immediate death because demons. And only having to deal with half a health bar is exponentially easier. So with our two rowdy rogues vital striking her with the fortune buff, she didn't really stand a chance. To be fair, I buffed everyone like crazy before this, popping almost all of our available scrolls and potions, but I did that primarily because I thought this encounter was going to last longer than, 2 attacks, but maybe it's survivorship bias, oh well. Afterwards, though, we have to have a pleasant conversation with Lan, who isn't all that happy about the, children eating people antics, resulting in a confrontation where we finally have to lock in which companion we wish to bring with us to the surface. We're gonna go ahead and bring along Lan, as Windlog has more or less served her purpose. She got us past the shield maze, and since Lan wasn't with us, he didn't have to bear 2 levels of baggage, so he has much more room to grow comparatively. So, leaving the shield maze behind us with Lan in tow, we're out of the frying pan and into fire as we're immediately thrust into the Grey Garrison. And this room right here. Okay, so usually before I do challenge runs like these, I commit to practice runs to see just how feasible the playthrough actually is. And this was the early game encounter I was dreading the most. Starting combat surrounded by dozens of enemies, with no time to prepare, with such a limited toolkit was a recipe for disaster. And then Camellia happened. Winter's Grasp is a spell we're actually going to have access to fairly soon, and holy shit is it insane in the early game. Really, it's effective throughout every stage of the game, but it is particularly overpowered in Act 1. It slows enemies, it damages enemies, and if enemies do not pass a reflex save, they fall prone, which is particularly devastating since that all but assures they're unable to land attacks. Which is made all the better when you realize that the enemies we are the most terrified of, a la the neophyte sharpshooters and cultist evokers, were particularly susceptible to this spell as most had to roll a 16 or higher to avoid falling prone. So from the very beginning of combat, most of the cultists were immediately promoted to floor inspectors. There were a few that managed to pass the reflex save and were attempting to close the distance, but a second Winter's Grasp hit the Grey Garrison, and that all but assured their demise. All we had to do was snipe off the prone cultists at range and promptly regroup with our allies before it was basically GG. And I mean, I'm aware that literally everything in combat is dictated by luck. This is an adaptation of a tabletop game after all, so at its core it's all dice rolls, but I was genuinely surprised that this only took a single attempt. But if nothing else, it's a perfect highlight of just how effective crowd control spells are going to be throughout the rest of the playthrough. Fortunately, the next few combat encounters were significantly easier due to the NPCs demolishing everything that dare stand in the way of their crusade. But we're about to hit yet another major roadblock that I was absolutely dreading. So remember when I said all the way back here that we're not going to count unavoidable damage? Well, while you are 100% intended to lose this battle, legally, you could totally argue that this may count as avoidable damage, so we have to find a way to kill, you know, an optional level 29 boss you'd normally fight in Act 4 with a level 3 party. Or at least that's what I thought, because I did discover an alternative solution. If you get really angry and choose the demonic option here, the fight is reduced down to a 1v1 between you and Minago, while all of your companions sit there and watch like it's the worst episode of Dragon Ball Z ever animated. That is if you pass the check. If you select this option, then fail, you instead succumb to your rage and 1v1 stun instead. And this poor bastard cannot cast spells, which makes the encounter infinitely easier. This still could prove to be problematic though. He did just carry us through the Great Garrison after all, and being stuck at level 1 doesn't help things much either. So I was totally prepared to restart here since we made loads of suboptimal decisions to avoid leveling up, and if we're forced to, we may as well exploit that to its fullest. But luckily, Stun has one problem plaguing him that completely warps this encounter from a considerable challenge to a damn execution. Stun was born a dwarf, and we start the fight right next to a rather large rock. By simply running around it and kiting him, he can never catch up to us, and if we defeat Staunton, we don't actually have to fight Minago. In fact, unless there's something I'm missing, this is actually ideal because if you talk to him again later, you can select a unique dialogue option where he expresses his condolences, stating that he knows what it's like to lose a battle against yourself, and gives you a unique cloak to help you out in the future. It's honestly really cute. I've never seen this dialogue, I've never seen anyone talk about this dialogue, and I don't think I ever would have if it wasn't for the fact I was doing a stupid challenge run and was forced to find alternative solutions to dumb problems. And really, it's small interactions like these that can make CRPGs feel so much more than the sum of their parts. Anyways, this officially marks the end of the prologue, which means that we can finally level up. You may be curious as to why I've been working with this bizarre limitation, and the reason is actually very simple. I would like to have mercenaries at the ready in case of the worst, because there's a non-zero chance that there's going to be an encounter that will require very specialized characters to defeat, and the fee for hiring them is your character level squared times 500. So at level 3, they cost a fairly considerable 4,500 gold, which is basically all the gold we have access to currently, and in the early game, gold can be an extremely valuable resource, so that isn't insubstantial in the slightest. But of course, at level 1, 1 squared is 1, times 500 is 500, and 500 is several orders of magnitude cheaper than 4,500. In fact, it's actually much cheaper than that, since mercenaries will come equipped with pre-generated gear in accordance to their starting class that you can promptly sell off for upwards of 250 gold. So we can basically get 20 for the price of 1. Now, of course, we're not going to actually hire 20 mercenaries. In fact, this entire endeavor isn't even strictly necessary. As I said earlier, it's just future-proofing in case of the worst, but all things considered, I think everything worked out fairly well. So we hired 5 more Buges of various classes, we finally leveled up, and holy shit do we have access to a power spike. So the Witch of the Veil archetype trades in their level 2 Hex for Shrouded Step, which allows them to become invisible for a number of rounds equal to their intelligence bonus. This would already be good in of itself because having invisibility at will is solid, but what makes this fucking busted is that this is a swift action, meaning that we can do this for free at the end of every turn, even after taking a standard action and a move action. And of course, by this point in the game, there aren't all that many enemies that can actually detect invisibility. There are a few you have to look out for, but you're usually safe as long as you utilize ranged weapons, terrain, and/or movement as necessary. So after only 2 levels of investment, all of Act 1 turns into this killing field where as long as you don't overextend, you're gonna win the encounter. Hell, even after Act 1, this will maintain its relevance all the way until the end credits, so we're gonna be using this for a while. And while it's totally feasible to take these 2 levels as a standalone dip with minimal investment, since we're already looking for an intelligence-based caster, I figured that it's worth it to continue down this path. Lots of people will tell you that the Witch spellbook isn't exceptional, and they're not entirely wrong. No pun intended, but it is definitely outclassed. But we are going to be able to remedy that with various decisions later on in the playthrough. That being said, we only really need to get a caster level of 17, so we can spend as many as 3 levels on various classes to alleviate our current weaknesses. There are tangible benefits from gaining extra caster levels, but without spoiling too much, the difference between 19 and 20 is literally unlocking a few extremely cool, albeit mostly redundant spells 15 to 20 minutes earlier than normal. So although 17 is a minimum, we can freely spend a level on whatever we desire to fortify our early game. So, of course, I got a level in Rowdy Rogue. Since I didn't really go in depth with it during the shield maze, to elaborate on why it's so good, with a single level we gain access to sneak attack, which gives us an extra 1d6 to damage as we're always going to be attacking from stealth, as well as Vital Strike, which is an extremely efficient attack that easily multiplies our raw damage output. Never mind the Rowdy's signature Vital Force passive that adds yet another 2d6 damage to Vital Strike. Yeah, this in tandem with Witch of the Veil isn't balanced at all for lower levels, and results in us one-shotting enemies that would otherwise take multiple attacks to defeat. It wouldn't be hyperbolic to suggest that this speeds up Act 1 by upwards of 200 to 300%. If you were to look at this build from a bird's eye view at level 20, this wouldn't be an optimal choice, but the opportunity cost is extremely low, so I decided to run with it. Oh yeah, also, remember how I said this is gonna be mostly a solo run? That didn't apply back in the shield maze because we literally could not change our party, but it's very applicable now. I know I discussed the active experience toggle earlier, but I don't know if I can stress how ludicrous a 6 times experience modifier is. It's not completely game-breaking, as the experience required to level up does increase rapidly, so we're going to hit walls in progression. It's not like we're going to hit level 15 in Act 1. But consistently being up about 3 to 5 levels where your party would normally be otherwise is incredibly powerful and helps make solo runs a niche yet viable playstyle. Especially for the purposes of this video, where playing solo is significantly less stressful and requires less overall mental bandwidth than actively micromanaging an entire party. Anyways, this is probably where you're expecting me to really dive into encounter design, but I'm going to focus more on meta progression because, as I stated earlier, this combo completely breaks Act 1. I enter combat, I see if I rolled first for initiative, if I didn't, I turn invisible and pass my turn, then I spam Vital Strike Shrouded Step until everyone dies. I'm sure people have already made this observation before, but admittedly, I tend to be a fan of challenge runs about meta progression and problem solving instead of just pure mechanical skill. There have been multiple excruciating challenge runs I've scrapped that could be considered mechanically impressive, but I sincerely don't know how to turn something like, I played through this game with an unorthodox control scheme, into a full video. And for better and for worse, Wrath of the Righteous is much more proactive than reactive. That isn't to say there aren't decisions to make in any given encounter, but generally you're better off focusing on your party composition and their respective builds. So for our general progression, there's a lot of stuff to prioritize. Firstly, we're going to get this hidden headband of Charisma +2 to shore up our persuasion checks, and then immediately recruit Wolja so that we can do his companion quest. There aren't any mandatory combat encounters within it, so it's very safe to rush, and the rewards are more than worth it. Firstly, you get Finian, which is just an incredibly powerful weapon with loads of flexibility. Then, if you pass a few difficult checks, you can find a hidden stash overflowing with gold, as well as a decently expensive ring that will also be selling off. And finally, you gain access to Woljif as a merchant with one item in particular I really want to have for the early game, which is the Wand of Heroism. Unlike most other wands that have maybe 15 to 20 charges up most, this monstrosity has 50, which is more than enough heroism to get us through Act 1, Act 2, and potentially even Act 3. And heroism is just a really damn good spell to have. If we weren't going to get it through this, we were always going to take it. So having access to it at all times while saving our very valuable spell slots is worth the admittedly steep initial cost. But afterwards, I decided to finally head towards the market square, and then immediately leave. So shortly after you leave this area for the first time, you'll get a random encounter with Nenio. And this is another Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous classic, where a cutscene inevitably results in a combat encounter and places your characters where they really do not want to be. Normally this would be fine, but since there's a companion you'll likely recruit just a few minutes after entering the area, and a rather squishy companion at that, if you don't immediately prioritize this, you basically have to play Protect Ember at all costs, the video game. Which, I mean, I'd argue is already the unofficial title for Wrath of the Righteous, but still. It's better to get this over with as soon as possible to minimize potential headaches. Well, Nenio in of herself is a headache, but she's a headache that's also a wizard, so it's probably worth keeping her around. If nothing else, to pawn off her starting equipment and to start her extremely fun quest. If you know, you know. We're gonna get there later. Returning to the market square though, before getting Ember, I decided to take Camellia along with me since she was just a few hundred experience away from hitting level 4. And with that level, she gains access to a new hex. Of course we're going to be using this level for yet another fortune, and after chanting and cackling for a few years, Buge is now rolling 3 dice whenever he does just about anything, so we are fully prepared to utterly obliterate Act 1. Of course we recruited everyone we could for the assault on the Great Garrison, even including Horun, because despite the fact he is a paranoid inquisitor seemingly bent on finding enemies everywhere he looks, I believe his reinforcements are slightly better than Ramian's, but more importantly though, you avoid all confrontations and get an imperial fuck-ton of experience for literally selecting the most obvious dialogue options when they appear, which is always a plus. And speaking of experience, we were able to rather quickly hit level 7, which with a full party, assuming you did everything you could, I believe you'd only reach near the beginning of Act 2. So discussing our character progression in more depth, I forgot to mention this earlier, but for level 3 feat, I decided to get improved initiative, which should be self-explanatory. Reliably going first in combat is absurdly valuable, as it allows us to land attacks on priority targets before they even get a chance to react. And it's only going to increase in value as our enemies grow more and more lethal. As for level 4, we're going to be continuing to level in Witch for a while, and of course every time we select an attribute, we're going to select Intelligence. Then for level 5, we unlocked Metamagic Selective Spell, which will come in handy very soon. And for a new hex, I selected Ice Plant because a flat +2 to AC is nice. Plus, we already have access to an incredible ring that increases that AC buff by yet another +2, which, as a brief aside, the overwhelming majority of stat buffs and bonuses in this game tend to be categorized within specific types. And in most cases, buffs within the same category cannot stack with each other, so untyped buffs are always going to be worth looking out for, as well as any category-specific buffs we may not already have access to. Anyways, as you could probably tell by the background footage, our level 6 was completely uneventful besides unlocking the next tier of spells. And finally, for level 7, we got Skill Focus. Specifically for World Knowledge, which is a pretty blatant telegraph for how we're going to be building our character, but that'll come later. Also, you may have noticed I did skip over our newly unlocked spells. That's because I want to cover all of them at once, as for the most part, they're relatively minor pickups. For second level spells, Bone Fists is okay for a flat +1 to AC. Glitter Dust and Sea Invisibility are going to help against a few invisible enemies hidden throughout the act, but I do really mean a few invisible enemies. I think there's like 5 or 6 or so in total, so it's still fairly niche. And finally, for third level spells, I did pick up Heroism in case we ever need it in the future. And Delay Poison will occasionally help counter the legions of Dretches we'll be fighting. But for the most part, the one spell I was the most hyped about was easily Winter's Grasp. Specifically Selective Winter's Grasp because I don't think this needs to be stated outright, but casting lingering AoE spells that can also damage us just isn't gonna happen in this video. So Selective Meta Magic is literally a lifesaver for us. But overall, I think it's very nice progress. Anyways, after we adopted a cute little cat and started to run out of enemies to kill in the market square, we traveled to the Silken Thread Atelier for some more items to pawn off, then the Tower of Estra to help make the upcoming tower defense much easier. Oh yeah, speaking of which, it is totally possible to beat this act without ever initiating it, but it does give you experience and gold, so I decided to prioritize it anyway. We still had quite a lot of time remaining though, so we went to the Blackling Library to recruit Ulbrig, rescue the Storyteller, and make the Grey Garrison much easier by selecting the funny Trickster dialogue option. Oh yeah, also we can pick up a magic essence here if we pass a perception check, which is going to be helpful for us later on. But afterwards, I decided to do the 2 remaining companion quests. Specifically Camellia's at the Gorm's Mansion, and Dayron's at the Erendé House Estate. Gorm's Mansion was simple for the most part. If you're not prepared, there are 2... Babaus. There are 2 Babaus here that will not hesitate to one-shot you if given the opportunity. But since your maximum crossbow range far exceeds the range in which they can actually detect you, as long as you maintain healthy social distancing, they're easy enough to dispatch. Dayron chicanery though was much more difficult by comparison. The problem is that these motherfuckers watched Gurren Lagann and can see the invisible, and with them chasing down and butchering all the innocent, well, hopefully innocent attendees here? Or maybe not hopefully, they did just get massacred in droves. My point is that it's not uncommon for them to directly path into me, which regularly results in my death. But after a few retries, I got fairly lucky with the AI's pathing, and it was worth the headache because Dayron is a great companion and is worth keeping around. Like, I'm sorry, but at this point I've completely abandoned any notion of attempting the mental gymnastics required to justify why Camellia, Dayron, and Regil are always in my party no matter the playthrough. They're my besties, and I love them eternally. But while we're at Dayron's funhouse, we also met with Aranka, which allows us to complete the side quest in the Temple of Desna, and after a quick detour we hit level 8 just in time to defend the tavern. Of course we're going to continue leveling Witch of the Veil, and of course we're going to get an extra point in intelligence, but as for newly unlocked level 4 spells, really the only one worth mentioning is Phantasmal Killer, which is going to become incredibly important very soon. Then it was time for the dreaded tavern defense I've mentioned by name several times now, and in a standard playthrough, this can be utterly nerve-wracking. There's just so much going on at all times, and it's easy to get lost in the chaos. But I'm gonna blow your mind when I say this. Stunlocking every enemy that spawns makes things a tad bit easier. And besides the usual benefits of being permanently invisible, most enemies would charge directly into Erebeth's meat grinder, which was much appreciated. So as long as we focused on vital striking the arsonists, everything was gonna be okay. But another important thing to note while we're here is that, in alternative timelines, Buge has conquered all the DLCs on Unfair, which means that we will have access to a few exclusive items hidden throughout the game. Unfortunately, completing Through the Ashes only rewards us with a rather mediocre wand, but trading it in for free 1500 Chuck E. Cheese tokens is still pretty nice, I guess. So with the Defender's Heart successfully guarded, we were free to explore the rest of Canabras at our leisure. So I wiped out the remaining cultists and demons hidden throughout the city before finally initiating the assault on the Grey Garrison. And unlike the last time we were here, Buge was very adequately prepared for the challenges to come. There's only really one notable encounter we have to be careful of, and that's against Jesslyn. There are several enemies in this room that can detect us, which makes the presence of rangers and spellcasters immediately lethal. But just like so many others before them, as long as we keep our distance, we're gonna be alright. Okay, actually there is an encounter worse than her, which is these antimatter babaos capable of warping through reality itself to poke us to death, but they're easy enough to sneak around. I played Sneak King on the Xbox 360, I know what I'm doing. Returning to the Wardstone yet again, this is where you're probably thinking, Davey, what in the hell are you gonna do against Minago? Well, fortunately, I have a plan. Maybe I don't though, because we have to go on a quick detour to see if I can avoid taking damage here. And unfortunately, for testing purposes, I decided to cheat in some flat DR, including several effects that were impossible to obtain this early into the game. And I couldn't actually lower the damage to 0. So this is the second case of plot-mandated self-harm. Now whenever I open up her character screen, there's a 7 next to damage taken where there would normally be a 0. Now I can't make a Reddit post taking a screenshot of my final stats for internet strangers to validate my hyperfixations. Woe is me. But ignoring that tragedy, as for the fight itself, literally all we have to do is win initiative. Remember earlier when I said Phantasmal Killer was going to be incredibly useful soon? Well, here's where it gets to pop off. Because if you're curious about what the mythical super buff you get here actually does, it makes it so that enemies fail every single saving throw. Which, of course, means that Phantasmal Killer is a guaranteed insta-kill. Very cool. And with that, we're finished with Act 1 and can move on to Act 2. First things first, we hit level 9 and unlocked our first mythic feat. Of course we went with yet another level in Witch. As you could probably tell from my earlier feat choices, I was debating whether or not to go with Lore Master or Witch first. But eventually I decided on Witch, which I am incredibly thankful for because that was absolutely the correct choice. The reason I was so indecisive about it in the first place was because Witch receives an upgrade to their Shrouded Step at level 8, so that it also teleports you up to 30 feet away from your starting position. Which, despite being a flat upgrade, initially I wasn't too keen on because that increases our rotational complexity by an entire 33%. Instead of pressing 2 left-click 3, we now have to press 2 left-click 3 left-click. That seemed extremely intimidating at first, but then I realized. I have a fucking teleport as an at-will swift action, which is way more fun than it has any right to be. Look at me go! But as for both the feat and the mythic feat, that's gonna remain a secret for later. But speaking of which, after Act 2 formally starts and we obtain a few items around our new Crusaders camp, including the Covenant of the Inheritor from the Storyteller, we had one primary objective that was to be fulfilled as quickly as possible. Act 2 is speedrunning Twink Death. So, I'm actually going to blitz through the beginning of the act because there's surprisingly little standing in the way of this objective. First and foremost, we have to get past Leper's Smile. Utilizing this new funky teleport, we can easily avoid all the Vescivore swarms and promptly blast a Vescivore Queen. It does heal 5 health every round, but as long as we're able to deal more than 5 damage on average every turn, this encounter was always going to result in a victory. Especially so because Anevia is actually a fucking hacker and was able to blast this dude point blank without ever getting detected. I don't really know how, but I'm not complaining. Afterwards though, we can pick up the Hunter's Assurance, which is actually our best ranged weapon for the time being. Being able to spread bleeds is incredibly valuable for a defensive playstyle. But surprisingly, there's only 2 mandatory areas remaining in Act 2. But of course, there's still all of the optional side content remaining, chief among which is, of course, Dayron's personal quest. So, in summary, this glorious bastard has had an otherworldly entity living inside of him for over 10 years now. With that entity, using him as a gateway to do very unhinged things. We've been seeing severed heads show up in our inventory inexplicably for a while now, and as you may have guessed, Dayron is the reason why. You learn about all of this through his companion quest, which luckily, just like Buge, doesn't have any mandatory combat encounters, so once you have access to it, there is nothing barring your progress from immediately completing it. And just like Buge's quest, there's some incredibly valuable loot to be discovered in the process, including one of the best caster helmets in the game, so it's very much worth doing. But after the quest is complete, we have the opportunity to completely and utterly break the game's progression. Due to the agreement that Dayron made with the Other, he is entirely unable to tell a soul about his secret. That doesn't mean he isn't willing to joke about it. The foreshadowing isn't exactly subtle when you know what's going on. But any genuine inquiries for help aren't going to happen. Both because Dayron is a dick, and because it's more or less immediately understood that doing so would result in both of your immediate deaths. You do eventually devise a plan to defeat it, all the way near the end of the game in Act 5, and it is usually considered to be one of the most difficult encounters in the entire game. However, by choosing some very bold dialogue options, you can choose to fight this thing as early as Act 2, which, buddy, it is a level 40 super boss we are fighting at full strength. It ain't fucking happening. However, this is where I get to mention those 2 feats from earlier. The first of which was bizarrely exotic weapon proficiency, specifically nunchaku proficiency. We could have gone for a monk dip to bypass defeat requirement entirely, but I eventually decided that going for a full 19 caster levels would be preferable, so I was happy to tank a feat for it. Anyways, the reason why this is important is because the Other is an undead. And if you encounter the skeletal salesman traveling around the world and request to buy exotic wares from faraway lands, you can purchase a Disruption Nunchaku. And disrupting weapons have a chance to instantly kill any undead upon hit. I think you can see where I'm going with this. But by virtue of the Other being an endgame boss, we aren't going to hit on anything less than a nat 20. And likewise, since they have to pass a save in order for them to be destroyed via the disrupting weapon, they have to roll a nat 1. Which means that we only have a 1 in 400 chance to instantly end the encounter. Which, of course, is assuming we can even reliably hit the thing, which is a predicament in of itself. The Other has access to several incredibly powerful endgame spells, and those endgame spells tend to end my game instantaneously. I suppose in theory I could spend several hours here reloading the encounter until I got perfect RNG, but I really didn't want to do that. Besides being very save scummy, which is something I have been actively avoiding in this challenge, it just didn't feel right. But fortunately, this is where an otherwise terrible mythic feat comes into play. Magic Nullification, on paper, sounds fine. Complete magic immunity sounds pretty good, but there are 2 problems there. Firstly, due to some weirdo nonsense, magic immunity doesn't always mean immunity to magic. There are loads of spell effects that can actually bypass this, which means that this feat can be an active detriment to use. How, you may ask? Because this also dispels any positive spell effects on you, and buffs are pretty fucking good to have in this rule set. So the benefit is situational at best, and actively debilitating at worst. I'm sure this is okay on easier difficulties if you are absolutely against pre-buffing in all forms. Although, even then, there are so many other options that would perform better overall. But on Unfair, where you have to leverage every buff at your disposal, it is never a consideration, especially as a first pick. That is, unless you could use it to, you know, hypothetically kill an optional endgame boss by being completely immune to all of its spells until you can kill it with a niche interaction. Yeah, maybe then it'd be, I don't know, alright. And now you may be curious. What's the reward for actually doing this? Well, nothing. We don't get any items. In fact, we actually lose Darren as a party member entirely. However, we do get experience. Holy fucking shit do we get experience. Being able to hit level 17 in Act 2 is not okay. For context, on my standard playthroughs where I hit up most, if not all, available side content, I usually only hit this level in the middle of Act 4. Meaning that, in regards to experience, we're at least 2 entire acts ahead of the curve. Yeah, looking at this build exclusively from level 20, this is technically suboptimal. But having access to this immediate power spike into the fucking stratosphere is absolutely worth the trade-off. Besides making all of Act 2, 3, and 4 significantly easier, which may as well translate to besides making 80% of the game significantly easier, the difficulty curve does tend to taper off near the mid to late game, so I think 9 times out of 10 this would be considered optimal. Especially considering what's about to happen next. So this is all fine and dandy. This allows us to run around and easily clear most Act 2 content that may otherwise cause problems, including obtaining a flawless Ring of Protection plus 7, which I don't think I need to add is extremely powerful, as well as the Ring of Evasion, which is similarly overpowered since spells that can be avoided via reflex saves are going to become much more common. But the best part is, if we rush to the Lost Chapel, which is normally near the end of Act 2, we're struck by an ambush and must recruit all of our companions who are currently fighting off the hordes of gargoyles swooping in to abduct our entire crusade. In case you missed it, let me repeat that. We must recruit all of our companions again. So, instead of having a full party of level 17s by something like late Act 4, early Act 5, depending on how completionist you are, we have that shit on lockdown at what is effectively the very beginning of Act 2. Yeah, it seems pretty good. Although I will interject here by saying that I was swiftly punished for my insolence because the Lost Chapel itself was hilariously painful due to a bug that kinda just broke everything. Or should I say 5 bugs. Buges, even. Yeah, our mercenaries came with us, and for reasons unknown to man, they auto-aggro onto fucking everything, and unlike our previous companions that could paradoxically be near death, but have also never taken any damage in their entire life, they do take permanent damage. And what's worse is that even if you exit combat as quickly as possible, the gargoyles tend to rally straight down the mountain, so for all intents and purposes, initiating combat is a fail state if we cannot end the encounter in a single turn. So we had 2 options here. Firstly, focus on never initiating combat and sequence break the Lost Chapel by rapidly teleporting all over the place like your friend who swears they don't have connection issues on other games to kill Nulkaneth as quickly as possible. And I was able to eventually do that, but since I skipped past so many triggers, it resulted in a lot of fucking bizarre consequences. Like Regil disappearing into non-existence and Dayron coming back to life to haunt me. And honestly, I don't really want to deal with that. I would say the last thing I need is for this game to become a shitty 2007 creepypasta. So while it's a lot less funny, I decided to focus primarily on ending combat as quickly as possible. So I brought along Lan and Camellia to hard carry me through this nonsense, and it was a fucking bloodbath. I mean, look at the encounter against Nolkaneth. I feel the need to state outright that this dude actually gave me a fair amount of trouble on my solo playthrough. Under normal circumstances, the fight isn't this immediate curb stomp 80v1. I guess I can't really complain too much about this turn of events, so while we're here, let's talk about our levels. For our newly unlocked Mythic feat, we're going to prioritize Abundant Casting, Improved Abundant Casting, and Greater Abundant Casting over the next 3 Mythic ranks, so that's simple enough. For our class, there isn't much I looked forward to in the later levels of Witch of the Veil, so I decided to go all in on Lore Master. Since we want to be as self-sufficient as possible, we primarily spent these levels focusing on obtaining valuable defensive spells. For example, our level 10 secret was dedicated to Mirror Image. Despite seeming like a fairly innocent level 2 spell, with our abundance of spell slots, this can easily equate to dozens of hits we're able to mitigate. So you can realistically expect this to stay active for the rest of the playthrough. We also picked up Mind Fog, which is absolutely incredible against enemies that can detect invisibility. Considering how much we already Buge Shrouded Step, it's always worth having a few spell slots dedicated to it in case of emergency. At level 11, we got Spell Focus Necromancy, which again is a pretty clear telegraph for Buge's character. For level 12, we actually got another level in Witch of the Veil just to unlock the next level of spells before choosing another Lore Master secret. And for our newly unlocked 6th level spells, we picked up Greater Heroism and True Seeing. Then for level 13, we picked up Greater Spell Focus Necromancy, and unlocked Eagle Soul for extra AC, Strength, Initiative, and auto-confirmed crits. There is a soft alignment restriction, but fortunately it's very easy to mitigate, so there's no cause for alarm here. Level 14, we learned Ice Body and Legendary Proportions because they're both incredibly strong buffs. Yet even more strength in DR is never going to be bad, and Ice Body giving us immunity to cold, electricity, and a few prevalent status effects at the trade-off of being vulnerable to fire is always going to be worth it. Because most fire spells can be entirely mitigated via the Ring of Evasion, never mind the fact that we can completely counter that potential weakness with immunity to fire damage later on. Then for level 15, well, we're actually going to stop leveling there for now because, as you may have guessed, all signs point towards Buge becoming a Lich. I know I'm skimming over a lot here, trust me when I say that Dresden was not an exceptionally fun time, even when super buffed by companions via greater enduring spells and skipping over every optional encounter, but there's a reason I'm doing this. Unfortunately, for as cool as all of the mythic paths are, and as much as I love all of them, most of them share one damning flaw. For some reason, even ignoring the mythic paths that are only unlocked in Act 5, mythic progression is insanely backloaded. For the most part, I believe Act 1 and 2 are paced perfectly, no complaints there, but it completely falls apart in the latter half of the game. For example, in Act 3, what is basically universally agreed upon to be the act with the most side content available, well, you get one mythic level almost immediately, and that is it until the point of no return in Act 4. Compare that to the end of Act 4, where some paths can realistically hit mythic level 6, 7, 8, and 9, all within the span of about 30 minutes, and I think you can see the problem here. You're going to be playing at Mythic 4 for the overwhelming majority of the game. And due to that fact, what are usually agreed to be the best mythic paths are Angel, Lich, and Trickster, and the reason why is fairly simple. Their power curve is extremely front-loaded. That isn't to say that they don't scale well into the late game. I mean, Trickster eventually turns it into a fucking walking simulator, but compare a demon who can get angry a few times a day to an angel instantly becoming a holy artillery battery that one-shots entire groups of enemies. Even if the former fucking rocks. I mean, every path in the game has their own exclusive theme that is the epitome of why do I hear boss music, and demons is actually something straight out of Doom. At least mechanically, it's not really a competition. More relevantly for Buge though, remember how I said earlier that the Witch spellbook is generally outclassed? Well, that's no longer an issue, as we have all of the Lich Mythic spells at our disposal, and they are obscenely powerful. Starting with the offensive spells, Vampiric Blade basically doubles our weapon's damage output. By the time we unlock this, our caster level will be level 20 with the Merge spellbook, and it turns out adding upwards of 26 damage per attack is pretty good. Consume Undead is great because incorporeal enemies are extremely annoying to fight. They can't really damage us, but we also can't really damage them outside of fishing for a disruption proc, leading to some excruciatingly long encounters, which Consume Undead puts an end to. Eyes of the Bodak has some fun niche cases that can make it exceptionally OP, particularly since it can work outside of combat and while we're invisible, which can realistically result in us killing off entire packs of enemies without any fear of reprisal. Bone Explosion. The target's bones explode within its body. Exsanguinate, on the other hand, is great for single target damage. 1d6 per caster level is a lot of damage for this early in the game. Never mind the fact that it only takes a level 5 spell slot, which we now had an excess of due to just unlocking improved abundant casting. Feast of Blood, on the other hand, is an AoE Exsanguinate. No notes, great stuff. Corrupt Magic is almost always worth allocating a spell slot to. You're never going to consider using it in most encounters, but against any boss or significantly buffed enemy, it is so debilitating that it can immediately trivialize some of the most difficult encounters in the game. And finally, Domain of the Hungry Flesh is what I consider to be our ultimate offensive spell. Sure, an AoE harm is pretty good, but Domain of the Hungry Flesh has a borderline broken interaction where if you're playing solo, have turn-based combat toggled on, and cast this near an enemy to initiate combat, it will end encounters before they even begin, and I don't mean that figuratively, I mean that literally. It does come with the minor trade-off that giving it selective is all but required, but Feast of Blood is so good that bolstering it to fill up our remaining level 8 spell slots doesn't feel bad in the slightest. Then for our newly unlocked defensive spells, well, this isn't really a spell, but I did choose Indestructible Bones as our first Lich power because it's amazing for quality of life. A flat 10 damage reduction that is effectively doubled on Unfair will reliably tank so many attacks that would otherwise force us to reload. So, although I'm sure there are better options available, I think this is just great to have early to minimize potential headaches. Bone Shield helps shore up our AC, as we haven't actually had a great source of shield armor yet, and Bone Shield helps remedy that by being one of the very best shield buffs in the game. Siphon Time is haste and slow combined into a single spell. Having access to haste as a witch is already pretty good, but having that extra utility means that it can be used offensively to pretty good effect. And finally, Blessing of Unlife is an ability that seems innocent at first glance, but honestly borders on game-breaking for us. I'm not kidding when I say that for all intents and purposes, this tooltip could read, become immune to all crowd control and status effect conditions in the game, and that would be mostly correct. Yeah, it's gonna be on us for the rest of the game. And due to our newly acquired Merge spellbook, we can now pick up level 8 and level 9 spells via our Lore Master secrets. So for level 15, as I alluded to earlier, we picked up Bolster Spell as our feat, and then Sea Mantle for an extra +8 to AC, +4 to reflex saves, which is especially good with a Ring of Evasion, and immunity to fire, which is pretty good. Arguably a little redundant, since most enemies opt into using spells a la Fireball or Firestorm that we mitigate via evasion. But being able to bypass the checks required entirely isn't bad, and of course against the occasional Hellfire Ray, it'll pay dividends. We also picked up Foresight and Heroic Invocation for yet even more AC, more bonuses to our reflex saves, inability to be flat-footed, and +4 to attack and damage rolls. Then finally, for level 17, we continued our meta magic spree with Extend Spell for some late game nonsense, and admittedly this is kind of a meme, but I learned Winds of Vengeance because it stacks with other movement speed buffs, and holy fucking shit, this turns Buge into a fighter jet. I mean, is the 50% chance for most attacks to miss via concealment great? Yeah. Is immunity to ground effects good? I mean, freedom of movement mostly does the same thing, and it's only a level 4 spell, but as a purely additive bonus, I can't complain too much about it. Is the immunity to breath attacks solid? Yeah, it's niche, but it actually came in clutch fairly regularly against some harder enemies. However, I primarily picked it up because quadrupling our movement speed is fucking stupid, and I am 100% here for it. So, all in all, although we're only going to get progressively more powerful, at this point we can reliably play the game in real time, and it's honestly beginning to resemble a CRPG less and less, instead looking more like a Diablo-esque ARPG, complete with killing hordes of demons with necromancy and never-ending stutter-stepping. Turn-based has been all but mandatory up to this point due to how initiative works and how attacks are distributed in real time. And although it is still going to be used regularly, it isn't even strictly required anymore since we have access to infinite teleports, unlimited stealth, most of our endgame spells including effectively permanent max level buffs, absurd survivability, and everything else we could ever ask for. If it wasn't for the additional condition of having to do this without taking any damage, we could just put on Payphone by Maroon 5 and blast through the entire game mostly AFK. The only things that can realistically damage us now are fairly low damage spells a la Magic Missile or Bone Shatter, and Lich just has access to absurd sustainability, never mind the possibility of picking up stuff like Last Stand as bad luck protection. Realistically, I'm fairly confident you could probably do Last Aslanti unfair with this setup. Of course I included that condition in order to mitigate this exact issue, but it is funny that no-name cultists that can cast magic missiles are basically on the same tier as demon lords in this challenge. But I digress. With this power spike, I decided to backtrack and go through most of the optional encounters in Dresden for yet even more experience. However, in terms of loot, I'm not kidding when I say that the only standout is the Triceratops statue, and not because we actually want to use Bismuth, but because he'll help with the occasional pressure plate puzzle and can serve as a temporary pack mule without the added responsibility of taking care of a literal dinosaur. Oh yeah, actually, vaguely speaking of pets, you may have noticed that I do not have Mr. Skellington with me. That's because the only other quality of life buff I decided to give myself, besides the increased cackle duration, is to outright abandon him in this playthrough. I just don't want him. Not even strictly because of the challenge run, it'd be fairly easy to give him more invisibility potions than God and leave him at the entrance of every area forever. But I really don't want to artificially extend the video's duration by constantly having to wait on stock skeleton number 193 to catch up to me every time I try to enter a new area. Especially since, being totally honest here, even if we were to take on 3 levels of baggage with the Shrouded Step Vital Strike God combo, Angel is still probably better for this playthrough. All the same benefits of obscene damage output, absurd defensive buffs, and survivability also apply to them. But Lich tends to prioritize lots of self-healing, eventually making Constitution as a stat entirely redundant, which of course is relevant in this playthrough. Meanwhile, Angel just has access to most of the very best buffs in the game via their spellbook, never mind their exclusive spells, which are fucking psychotic. I mean, we'd have Sunform by this point, and that basically reads, become immune to physical damage. I don't think I need to elaborate on why that would be pretty good in this playthrough. However, although I like the Path of Righteousness, I will forever have a soft spot for Crusaders and Paladins wielding the Holy Light to smite the heretical in the name of divine retribution. Lich is insanely cool, and I honestly just wanted to play them instead. So to loop back to the Skeletal Champion, with a full party, he's not great. I've never had him contribute more than 3% of my party's total DPS, but he's not an active detriment to keep around. Honestly, he's kind of endearing in his own spooky way. In solo play, though, he's just really fucking annoying. I'm sorry, buddy. But once I felt adequately prepared, we went ahead and fought Staunton for the last time, which realistically was only about as difficult as our first encounter against him in the Great Garrison. Like my first attempt, I actually fucking nuked the poor bastard with 2 back-to-back crits. But after combat ended, I pulled some enemies I skipped over and took damage like an idiot, so I was forced to reload. But he didn't fare much better on round 2. Once again, his pitiful movement speed proved to be his bane, and with our overlapping crowd control spells, he was inspecting the floor for the entire fight. Minago can be a pain in the ass, but she's entirely optional. You don't have to deal any damage to her to end the encounter, so we're going to focus all of our attention on blasting the miserable dwarf one last time, formally ending Act 2, and marking the beginning of Act 3, where I get to immediately invoke a rare South Park clip.
I can't believe it's all over. What do we do now? What do you mean? Now we can finally play the game.
Yeah, this absolute speedrun of Act 2 was all in service of making Act 3 as smooth and relaxing as possible. We're still going to prioritize a lot of high-value targets, but now the real game begins and we can start to take things easy. So first thing on the agenda, we're actually going to bum rush Mythic 4. As a Lich, we did have to wait literally a month to construct an actual Ziggurat and a Pillar of Skulls, so I did also do some Crusade nonsense in the meantime, but technically there isn't a single mandatory combat encounter between the beginning of Act 3 and getting our 4th Mythic level. There are a few patrolling enemies we have to look out for, and there is a mandatory-ish confrontation past a certain threshold, but even that you can skip with stealth. And with our Mythic level 4, of course we obtained the final Abundant Casting feat, which is exceptional for obvious reasons. We've already been making good use of all of our spell slots granted by Abundant Casting and Improved Abundant Casting, so utilizing more of our newly unlocked 7th, 8th, and 9th level spell slots is going to be a great time for us. Then we decided to rush Wintersun because it is by far the best source of experience at the start of the act. Morveg, for example, was barely an inconvenience. As a general rule of thumb, if you're fighting anything that stands on the ground, with legs or various appendages, 90% of the time they are extremely susceptible to being annihilated by anything that targets reflex saves, which in this playthrough will primarily be Winter's Grasps with the occasional Domain of the Hungry Flesh. So with minimal effort, with active experience gains turned on, this rewards Buge with a casual 180,000 experience. That is absurd. That is enough experience to skyrocket a player from level 10 to level 13 instantaneously. And again, this dude was stunlocked the entire fight. This wasn't a difficult encounter. And trust me when I say that this is far from the only absurd source of experience from Wintersun. Hell, as a Lich, we even get some decent experience from literally selecting a dialogue option that also comes with the ability to cast Stone Skin. An incredibly powerful spell for a challenge like this, and better yet, it's a buffed variant of it, which makes this exchange all the better. But to do that, we first have to return to Dresden, in which we're going to justify a quick side quest to do Olberg's quest, as it contains 2 of our very best items. And besides this, admittedly very obnoxious encounter that I was fortunately able to decimate with our newly unlocked Lich spells, doesn't require too much effort to acquire. So before you get the quest to return here in Act 3, there's a corpse on this tree that you can knock down for minimal gain. It is a bizarrely high skill check for little more than a, hey, thanks for doing that, I guess, from our local Scandinavian dude. There is a point in doing this, though. When revisiting this area in Act 3, you can search this corpse again for the cat's boots, which is incredibly powerful. Disabling attacks of opportunity enables us to kite enemies more obnoxiously than ever before. But in tandem with the Elfkel that we can quickly obtain over in Gundren, the enhancement bonus to dexterity is increased to +6, which makes it far better than the +4 usually given to us via Cat's Grace. And we also get an extra +5 to initiative, which is actually fucking massive. Improved initiative is borderline mandatory for unfair, and that's only a +4 to initiative. However, unlike the enhancement bonuses, these 2 effects stack, so on top of the extra initiative granted by the boot's dexterity, this is nothing short of phenomenal and almost guarantees we'll go first in any combat encounter. At least in Act 3. And this is all ignoring the Owl's Cowl itself, which gives a considerable +6 enhancement bonus to Wisdom and a +2 to AC, both of which are also extremely capable buffs. Yeah, altogether, these are going to remain on us for most of the playthrough. There are also other items worth obtaining in Gundren. In fact, since we're Lich, we can get one of the better ones without ever having to enter combat because this bozo tries to raise the undead against you, which allows you to select a dialogue option that more or less reads, "That's cute. Die." But the rest do require some painful combat encounters, which I'm totally okay with skipping, at least for the time being. Returning to Winter Sun, though, we're going to kill all the enemies scattered throughout the zone for a side quest we'll embark on shortly. Promptly annihilate Marhavok. Suddenly realize we never even got the war for Winter Sun in the first place due to some Shrouded Steppe nonsense. Apparently revive him, then return of a Chieftain's Hut to confirm that he was, in fact, still dead. Somehow I'm getting the interpretation that you are not supposed to have infinite teleports at this point in the game. Weird. Anyways, we're going to hit up all these standing stones for Ronick's Sacrifice, which is going to be our best in slot boots later in the run. And all this mayhem was enough to get us to level 18, which unfortunately was entirely uneventful. Then, it's time for ghosts. Remember when I said earlier that fighting specters wasn't really as difficult as it was annoying and tedious? Yeah, every combat encounter honestly resembled 2 dementia-ridden senior citizens in a nursing home trying to kill each other over Scrabble. No one was ever at risk of actually taking damage, but there is always an astronomically low chance that the enemy will instantaneously perish due to some weirdo nonsense. We were all but guaranteed to win. It was just gonna take forever. I mean, to be fair, there were a few encounters where their toolkit was expanded to be somewhat problematic, a la this one that always starts with a permanent baleful polymorph that I had to bait out via summons. And especially this one over here that will not hesitate to flood the screen with bullshit. But Consume Undead proved its worth on the more difficult fights, so they weren't that big of a concern. But once we finally overcame all 7 specters, we got a considerable 117,000 experience points. Which is nowhere near enough to get us to level 19, but is still a considerable amount for this early into the act. And with that, we can leave Winter Sun behind us to hit up a few merchants for gear. Specifically the Bracers of Animal Fury from the Arcane Weaver and Dresden, which is just a static +3 bonus to attack and damage rolls, which is obviously exceptional. As well as the... I have to do this again. The Haramaki of Scholarship, which does work with mage armor and does give us some extra AC, which is helpful as always. The bonus to Arcana and Concentration are far from negligible, but really we appreciate it for being a buffed up +3 Haramaki. Then we're going to hit up the Midnight Isles and, admittedly, sequence break the game again. Before you even begin your Hello Kitty Island adventure, there's a vendor over here that sells basically every region in the game, which in of itself is nothing short of incredible, but what makes this borderline game-breaking is the fact that he also sells every Scroll Scriber kit and every recipe, which allows you to prepare endgame recipes way earlier than was ever intentional. There is definitely a world in which it would be considered optimal to boost up another War Master with the express purpose of scribing scrolls, before spending several years in Dresden so he can freely spam every single remotely viable buff for the rest of the campaign. However, that sounds really fucking boring. And besides the appeal of freeing up several spell slots for more bone explosions and feasts of blood, there aren't all that many buffs I'd say my character really needs by this point. There's only a handful I'd consider truly exceptional, and trust me when I say that having to choose one for a final War Master secret took me way longer than I'd like to admit. But besides those few, most of the remaining buffs are either fairly minor, niche, or somewhat redundant. Ignoring that for now though, this vendor is still incredibly powerful because they sell the recipe for Conflagrant Tacos. This is normally only available in Act 5, all but requires you to make sacrifices for it, and is hidden behind a fairly difficult check. And there's a good reason why. When the fajitas come out sizzling, you get a flat +4 increase to all of your ability scores, and it is easily considered to be the best food buff in the game. In fact, this is the main reason why I prioritize Knowledge World over Knowledge Arcana when choosing one for War Master. It is always worth having whenever possible. But after we learn how to cook, we can finally venture onto the Midnight Isles themselves, and this DLC is just so absurdly good to do in any playthrough. There's multiple best-in-slot items, there's absurd gold generation, considerable experience gains. Really, there isn't much reason to not do this as quickly as possible. I mean, is it a fun time? It's lucrative though, and since we can change our party at any time, we're able to utilize every buff at our disposal, which results in a lot of indiscriminate carnage. But for the notable loot, the first island has Evercold, which is generally considered to be the best heavy crossbow, and I 100% agree with that assessment. For all intents and purposes, it gives you an extra attack that can also deal some extra damage. Although spreading dots with Hunter's Assurance was fun, we now have access to an AoE Exsanguinate, which makes it a lot less necessary. So Evercold will be our primary ranged weapon for a long while. Vaguely speaking of which, the Gloves of Phlebotomy is really our first solid pair of gauntlets. We've mostly been running around with the Gloves of the Ambassador for lack of a better option, but this is a considerable improvement as stacking bleeds is very effective. I wouldn't be as crazy about this if it was in a more valuable slot. Like I said earlier, we already have access to Exsanguinate and Feast of Blood if we really need to spread bleed damage. But as a passive, purely additive buff, it's incredibly solid. Dealing several d6 damage per turn isn't anything to scoff at, and really helps speed up some more obnoxious encounters. The Hat of the Bitter End is also absurdly good, but admittedly, I do think we usually have access to better options. If we leaned more into being a martial character, this would be one of our best items, but for now, it's good to have on standby. And just like the Cat's Boots Owl's Cowl combo, we have access to another set of items that are similarly overpowered. The Robes of Unspeakable Truth, and the Glasses of Undeniable Truth. Together, these give you a permanent True Seeing buff, +2 to Initiative, +2 Intelligence, +2 Wisdom, and a 10-foot aura that spreads fear to any nearby enemies. Again, individually, there are way better items in both slots, but as a combined package, it's gonna stay on our Buge for a very, very long time. So, altogether, especially considering how overpowered Buge is by this point and how he was able to trivialize almost every combat encounter, it was definitely worth the time spent here. Even if I am admittedly exhausted from running these same 13 dungeons back to back to back to back to back ad nauseum. But with the experience granted by this, we were remarkably close to level 19, so I decided to return to the Lost Chapel to beat all the optional encounters there. And for our final Lore Master level... well, our final feat was simple enough. Heightened Spell is mostly redundant for the time being, as every spell we'd want to raise the level of can be affected by either Extend, Bolster, and/or Selective Metamagic. But it's fairly likely we're going to be choosing Favored Metamagic as one of our later mythic feats, so this will help a lot in the late game. But for our final secret... I'm not even kidding, I actually spent an hour here diving through wikis and trying to figure out what the best option would be. Primarily, we were looking for buffs that didn't overlap or otherwise compete against buffs we already had access to, which by this point was surprisingly rare. But eventually managed to whittle it down to Sense Vitals or Divine Power. Divine Power, for all intents and purposes, can be treated as an untyped +6 buff to attack and damage rolls, which is insanely fucking powerful. However, it also comes with a haste effect, and seeing as we already have haste, that means about half of its appeal is made immediately redundant. So, although I would be able to completely understand, and even agree with every argument in favor of Divine Power, I eventually decided to pick up Sense Vitals because we've almost exclusively been landing sneak attacks, and treating this as an additive 5d6 damage on every attack is pretty solid. Especially with Evercold and Haste, and especially with our newly unlocked spell, Transformation. Which, admittedly, I should have picked up a long time ago. So this does come with a notable downside of being unable to cast spells while it's active, which does kinda suck. But it's nowhere near as debilitating as you may initially expect, because if we're trying to auto-attack everything to death, it is highly unlikely we were ever planning on using spells in the first place. And we can still use our abilities, including Shrouded Step and Bit of Fun, so assuming we're already buffed up, this is basically pure upside. So, what does the buff give us? An extra 11 base attack bonus, which, by proxy, also gives us an extra 2 attacks every single turn. Let me remind you that we're already dealing an extra 23 to 28 damage per attack with Vampiric Blade, and now our sneak attacks add yet another 6d6 per hit. This is all entirely additive, mind you. This is ignoring the weapon's damage rolls in of themselves, and together that is upwards of 64 damage per attack. And with 6 attacks per turn, that can result in a lot of damage. And of course, it's only going to get better and better with time, so overall, I'm happy with our decisions here. But with that finished, the only remaining quests worth doing are the ones where we recruit companions and/or obtain powerful gear. Namely for Land/Windwog, Ember, Woljif, Greyboar, and Arushale, with Woljif being particularly important thanks to his Thiefling connections. Then we're going to hit up the Hell Knight Outpost with Regil for the +1 buff to all skill checks, before finally completing the Dragon Hunt with Greyboar to get the Storyteller back in town. This actually proved to be somewhat difficult, as we are ganked by the dragon before we get to Grimwood, and without the ability to pre-buff, Greyboar was all but guaranteed to die if we weren't able to burst the dragon down on round 1. But fortunately, with bolstered Exsanguinates further buffed with a Maximize and Quicken Metamagic Rod respectively, we were able to pass the DPS check. And the next 2 fights against it give you way more time to adequately prepare, so it was nowhere near as difficult. Before the final encounter, there is a storybook event that can potentially cause a lot of problems, as any failed check results in you taking damage. But Buge is extremely athletic, so he was able to pass 2 consecutive checks with relative ease. For our troubles, we also found the second half of the pair, which is worthless for solo play, but may become exceptional if additional party members are ever necessary. And besides a few other short ventures, Owl of the Molten Scar, Crimson Dust, and so on, all we have to do before the point of no return is finally venture into the Ivory Sanctum, and... Remember when I said we recruited Greybor? Well, we did grab him for the Dragon Hunt because he is required for that, but once that was complete, I decided to let him go. If we're being completely pragmatic, keeping him alive is optimal, since his Act 4 quest actually gives you an Imperial fuck-ton of gold. But the problem with that assessment is it implies that Greybor is ever worth keeping around. It's not a great sign when your character is so fucking stupid that the only way his motivations make any semblance of sense is assuming he's actively suicidal. Like, sure, you're level 9, and you have literally no gear. Why not try to 1v1 the level 19 Lord of Death with your bare fists for an entire... 6 grand? This makes the reason he's in fisticuffs even funnier, because from the moment you recruit him, you can just sell off his starting equipment for 30k. Which makes hiring him for the express purpose of pawning off all of his shit one of the most optimal things you can do at the start of Act 3 in any playthrough. This man is supposed to be a seasoned mercenary, by the way. Anyways, entering into the Ivory Sanctum with the help of Bismuth, I actually wasn't all too worried about surviving. This place certainly isn't a walk in the park. It's not like we can turn on real time and just auto-attack everything to death. We do have to play extremely defensively, but the labyrinthine layout really lends itself to chicanery. Kiting is extremely easy due to there being dozens of rooms to fall back to. Even against ranged enemies, abusing line of sight is simple enough. Never mind the very real potential to abuse surprise rounds by constantly resetting aggro. And if burst damage was ever necessary, landing massive AoE spells is very easy due to the multitude of choke points we can funnel enemies into. So honestly, although it took a while to clear, it's nothing we haven't seen before. That is, until we get to the Bridge of Death. There is yet another classic Wrath of the Righteous moment here, where after a brief, tragically unskippable cutscene, we're immediately thrust into a casual 13v1 against a host of mythic demons. There's nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. Once you cross this threshold, you're officially in Mr. Bone's wild ride. However, as you may have noticed from the in-engine cutscene, this marks yet another instance of a cheese that's going to remain viable throughout the rest of the playthrough. You saw this back in Dresden at the end of Act 2, but if there is any combat encounter against enemies that aren't hostile yet, whether they aggro after dialogue or after a brief cutscene, we can stack the odds in our favor by making sure that they begin combat in the most hellish conditions possible. Which is usually going to be a combination of Winter's Grasp, Mind Fog, and Domain of the Hungry Flesh. Although, that being said, this was nowhere near as necessary as I thought it would be, because, as it turns out, bolstered, maximized Feasts of Blood are pretty good and immediately take out 9 of the 13 demons before they even had a chance to act. To be fair, the remaining 4 demons did have a fairly decent chance of landing a hit on me, but the Ring of Evasion continued to prove its worth and completely mitigated all the incoming attacks. From there, all we had to do was continue blasting them with even more Feasts of Blood, until all that remained is Deglabrazu, who by this point was so far away from me that he couldn't even detect me. And with their Mythic Overcharge dealing damage over time until their death, all we had to do was stay in this corner and it was GG easy. And fortunately, after a quick rest, Xanthier Vang was more of the same. Under normal circumstances, this is arguably one of the most annoying boss encounters in the game because swarms demand you have a hard counter against them. I wouldn't agree personally because even in egregious cases, DLCs and expansion packs for single-player games tend to be exempt from pay-to-win conversations. But I feel like it says a lot that Ulbrig comes equipped with an item that is specifically designed to hard counter swarms because there is nothing more humiliating than watching your entire party crumple to a legion of like a dozen rats. However, I specified under normal circumstances because we have access to a wide variety of spells that entirely bypass their immunities, so unlike most playthroughs, his phase 2 isn't a concern in the slightest. If you noticed, I skipped over phase 1 entirely there. Just like the bridge from earlier, we're able to precast crowd control spells before combat initiated, so he was immediately annihilated by hungering flesh like a dummy. And finally, for his phase 3, I legitimately couldn't tell you what he does. I know I can face tank him, but with this movement speed, why even bother letting him get into melee range? May as well play it safe and cyberbully him in his last moments. Just make sure you don't taunt him into a phase 4 like me. There's no incentive to provoke him further, so it accomplishes nothing and only adds a completely unnecessary fail state. But with Xanthier finally defeated, all he had to do was knock out Jerebeth, and we were done with the Ivory Sanctum. And by proxy, all mandatory content in Act 3 until the point of no return, which I decided to embark on almost immediately. And, there is a massive problem that is made immediately apparent here. Shrouded Step, the ability that has been hard carrying this entire playthrough, is guaranteed to fail in the Midnight Fane. That's because all teleport spells and abilities are disabled here to prevent sequence-breaking shenanigans, which is fair enough, but since we no longer have access to the level 2 variant of Shrouded Step without the teleport, invisibility is off the menu, and we're gonna have to face your fears head-on. For the lesser demons, that's actually totally fine, since Buge went through an extensive pre-buff ritual before entering the Fane, so he can face tank most of them. Against the multitude of bosses and ambushes, though, things are gonna be tricky here. Initially, I thought my salvation would be the holy vanguard who joined us in this festering hole, but they are completely useless. I mean, technically they're immortal, however we need to reset combat in order for them to rise from their prone state, which is already inconsistent at best without Shrouded Step. But once they're at low health, they simply do not deal enough damage for this to ever be a viable solution. Never mind the fact that they are entirely unavailable throughout multiple sections of the Fane. At the very least, their sheer incompetence means that I could justify completely ignoring their calls for aid. I mean, being real here, there is no way in fuck this act is ever going to end with a queen's approval, so I decided they could handle things without my direct intervention. But as for the rest of the encounters, things weren't totally hopeless. The Lich spellbook was proven to be formidable as always, and once an area was clear, we were given ample opportunity to rest, which, alongside the opportunities to cleanse our corruption, we were able to fully embrace a nuker playstyle. It was far from efficient. There was a very real chance I would have to start tanking the effects of Abyssal Corruption, but as long as we were able to survive, efficiency wouldn't matter in the end. So after dipping in and out of the Abyss, the first of the 3 keys required to progress was simple enough to obtain, actually. Hilariously, our move speed is so fast that we don't even need to utilize stealth or invisibility to reset the boss's aggro, so by constantly entering and re-entering combat, with our high initiative always resulting in us going first, we were able to slowly whittle away Baphomet's High Priest with pure chicanery. Then the second key was incredibly simple to obtain since our skills were more than high enough to easily persuade Nocticula's priestess that Buge is actually a pretty cool dude. We even came to the agreement that Greybor is a dummy, to dunk on him one last time before his entire existence is but a fleeting memory. And finally, Discari's High Priestess is an encounter that has given me loads of trouble before. During my practice runs, I had to really pull out all the stops, like baiting out over-lethal, high-level spells with summons before abusing the turn-based toggle in line of sight to avoid her bone shatters, which were an instant game over. However, in this playthrough, she was totally content just standing in the hell pit of death until I could promptly blast her with 2 Consume Undeads. And from there, all we had to do was annihilate the swarms with the ever-reliable Feast of Blood, and we were set to fight Darazand. But not before the second instance of plot-mandated damage, of course, which was another 1d10 plus 5, with a roll being a 13 for a combined total of 20 at this point. Yippee. But as for the fight itself, I mean, I'm not even certain if I could call this a cheese. It's more of a failure on their part than anything, if I'm being honest. If the demon's most fearsome generals can't even see 15 feet in front of them without assistance, maybe we need to consider sending a few cultists off the front lines to pursue a career in optometry instead. Like, I'm not even using any invisibility spells or effects here, this is just the basic sneak toggle and the poor bastard can't figure out what's going on. At some point in Harabro, aggroed onto him too, which wasn't necessary at all, as we were on track to end the encounter entirely AFK, but just like your 4-year-old nephew watching you play a game while excitedly button-mashing a disconnected controller you gave him, even if he was realistically a hindrance and accomplished nothing, I'm glad he felt included by the end, and I don't want to steal that joy from him. Anyways, after that circus, Gelfrey sends us away to Super Hell because she knows full well that her fate is to be slain by Buge and wishes to delay the inevitable. And it's time for the most boring part of the game. At least for this video. If CRPGs love one thing, it's starting off a new act by catapulting a player directly into the heart of a sprawling open city, complete with a constant assault of the senses, with the only direction given being, I don't know, go do shit, I guess. To be totally clear, I'm not against it, but it's weird how prevalent they are considering how many players completely bounce off of them. However, Elutionira has one saving grace, which I believe is evidenced by the surprisingly tame drop-off in global achievement stats, which is that it is exceptionally short. I mean, is it overstimulating as all fuck? Yeah. Whether or not this is a good or bad thing is up to personal preference, but they completely nailed the feeling of exploring a perpetually shifting city drifting through a chaotic evil abyss. But there's only a single quest you have to complete before you're given the opportunity to leave the city. And to be fair, it is a quest that does involve a lot of steps, but even then you can satisfy all the requirements in as little as 3 quests, with the other 2 being remarkably on rails. Of course, as a new player, you're not going to know that, and it doesn't particularly help that every fucking companion has unfinished business here for some reason, but just like Act 2 and Act 3, we can efficiently rush through the main quest to obtain some critical power spikes for a substantial boost throughout the rest of the act. So, you ready for the 6 speedrun strat? Enter the lower city, go to the Prologue Tavern, pay 500 gold for a coin to serve as a fast travel node to the lower city, exit the tavern, pass an intimidation or athletics check to access to middle city, then enter the flesh markets. Buy all the best in slot items from the vendors if you'd like, but make sure to get another coin to secure quick access to the middle city. Afterwards, reach the upper city. Immediately request Alexia's patronage, teleport back to the Prologue Tavern, then go to the Battle Bliss Arena. Enter the Battle Bliss and have a fun date with V, but make sure you don't select the same alignment option repeatedly for the best outcome. Then exit the Battle Bliss to get a coin to secure quick access to the upper city, head back into the Battle Bliss, get a demon grafted onto you as it's an incredibly powerful permanent buff with no tangible downsides in this playthrough, then chat to Zakaleks and kill everything that dares enter the arena. You don't even have to leave if you select the correct dialogue options, just back-to-back-to-back encounters with no pauses. Hit level 20, get abducted, finish the Battle Bliss quest, teleport back to the flesh markets, head over to Shamira's Harem of Ardent Dreams for yet even more riveting conversations, exit and enter again, chat with Shamira for a quest, teleport back to the Prologue Tavern, drop 100k on information for the beggar, go to the Battle Bliss, go to the Upper City, go to the Mage's Tower, talk to the Storyteller, go to the Nexus, run away from some crystals, go to the Mage's Tower, talk to the Storyteller again, take another D10 plot-mandated damage for a total of 25, go back to the Harem of Ardent Dreams, talk with Shamira, go back to the Terrace of Favored Mistresses, talk to Valexia one last time, and there you go. Following an exposition dump and yet another D6 of plot-mandated damage for a combined total of 30, that's Mythic level 6 secured, and with the Lexicon of Paradox in the other room, we were poised to pass all the checks with some help from Fortune, resulting in a minuscule AC bonus against demons, which isn't worthless, but moralistically I just wanted to be able to say that I did it. But we can then return the book for early access to Nocticula's Profane Gift, which is a considerable boost to our highest stat, which is pretty damn good. And from there, Illusioneer was ours for the taking because with a base caster level of 19, and with another 8 levels provided to us by our Lich Mythic Path, with greater enduring spells and extended mana magic, we were able to permanently maintain all of our buffs, which turned Buge into an ADHD monstrosity. I mean, that implies he wasn't already, but I guess he's even more so now. It's actually disgusting, honestly. And of course, following this obscene power spike, the highest priority location is the Midnight Isles yet again. But before we sail away, there's a few other great items that we can secure. Firstly, the Mage's Tower, we can obtain Ronick's Sacrifice and Shy Lily's Helmet, which are both easily best-in-slot contenders for boots and helmets respectively. Although for the former, at least for the time being, I found the immunity to attacks of opportunity provided by the cat's boots to be far better. We don't really intend on letting anything get close to us, but if things ever go astray, they're still an invaluable asset for us. I do want a solid enhancement bonus to dexterity though, so to help out our ability scores even more, we return to the Midnight Fane to 1v1 the Playful Darkness. This fight is rather infamous for being a complete build check, where even on lower difficulties, if your party is not equipped to deal with their comically high stats thanks to them having basically every fucking buff in the universe, victory is all but mathematically impossible. Most players just aren't gonna stumble upon a base attack bonus of 112. It's not a thing that really happens. However, for this playthrough, delaying this fight wasn't due to necessity, but rather convenience. Besides the Battle Bliss Arena, which was pitifully easy, we didn't have to fight a single enemy throughout the entirety of Act 4 thus far. So I figured it was worth delaying this fight for later. And I believe that was the correct call because the dude was not prepared for our empowered domain of the Hungry Flesh. I was fully prepared to roll for initiative and to finally bust out corrupt magic. Ecstatic that it was finally going to be able to utterly decimate a boss and prove its worth in our spellbook, but unfortunately that opportunity never came as the dude just keeled over and died then and there. I guess I can't be too upset though, as he was guarding some pretty good loot. Specifically the Flawless Belt of Physical Perfection plus 8, which may legitimately be a contender for one of the best items in the game, full stop. The sheer amount of stats it provides are insane, and the increased critical chance is nothing short of spectacular either. It also helps that in the same room, there's a tome that gives us an extra +2 inherent bonus to our dexterity, which is also pretty neat. But returning back to the Abyss, we're going to return to the 10,000 Delights to finish Grudges to Settle. Quick side note here though, at first I thought Shrouded Step was going to be incredible in Illusioneera because there is so much loot hidden on top of rooftops or otherwise inaccessible areas. Honestly, I think the developers did a great job at really incentivizing exploration within this act. But for some reason, the game really does not like this ability and will not hesitate to throw you across the map for your transgressions. It was kinda funny the first few times, but it lost its novelty exceptionally quickly. I guess by the end of the act, I was thrown across so many times that I was actually utilizing this bizarre behavior to navigate through the city faster, but it was still extremely annoying nonetheless. Seriously, the amount of times I've suddenly been warped to this rooftop right here and had to reload because I failed the check to get down is... I don't want to talk about it. Anyway, returning to the 10,000 Delights, we unlocked Herax as a vendor whose stock contains 2 incredible items for us. Lizard Tail, one of the best tank items in the game, especially alongside another item we'll be securing soon, and bizarrely, the Whistling Killer. I honestly severely underrated the latter until now because if you're going for a dedicated ranged character, it's better to specialize in longer range options a la bows or throwing axes. And its main appeal is somewhat invalidated by the existence of the Bane of Spirit, quite possibly the best support ring in the game. But with that ring being entirely unusable in this playthrough, the Whistling Killer secured a new lease on life, and it's doing pretty well for itself. And alongside all of our permanent buffs, we utterly decimated the Midnight Isles. Although the loot is fairly front-loaded for a character, it is still worth finishing, as this DLC is going to become extremely important in Act 5. But speaking of that front-loaded loot, the Robe of the Seven Sins and the Ring of Triumphant Advance. The former is really easy to understand, it's just a flat +3 caster levels. I honestly don't think I need to elaborate further. The latter is also fairly simple. It literally just doubles our morale bonuses, and although morale stat bonuses are going to be fairly rare, it is absolutely worth keeping on for the extra +4 to attack and damage rolls provided by Heroic Invocation alone. Never mind the additional buffs to our skill checks and saving throws via greater heroism. And if extra AC is ever critical, Lizard Tail gives us a considerable +6 bonus with an extra +8 on top of that during the first round of every combat. Yeah, both of our new acquisitions are likely going to be on our character for the rest of the playthrough. There's a few other decent items we picked up while we're on our island adventure, but unfortunately none of them are really worth highlighting here. And likewise, there wasn't really many notable encounters. Honestly, the only fight that put up any resistance was the final boss, which wasn't even as difficult as much as it was extremely annoying. It is a pure ad fight where we can only kill one specific enemy at a time, and since most of them can reliably deal damage to us if we overextend, this results in an encounter where the optimal strategy is to just maintain as much distance as possible while auto-attacking everything to death. Yeah, it wasn't particularly fun, but at the very least victory was all but assured. But after that riveting encounter, I'm actually prepared to head to Colfier to end Act 4. I'll elaborate on why I'm rushing this in just a second, but for the time being, there is a storybook event before we reach the mines with some fairly high checks to avoid taking damage, but fortunately I was able to pass them with enough consistency to get here entirely unscathed. Never mind, actually. Mostly unscathed, because the event begins with some more plot-mandated damage that has no associated check, which is utterly bizarre because nothing indicates that you should take damage here. At first I was certain it was due to failing a check, because there are a lot of them with multiple different outcomes depending on previous choices, so maybe I was simply selecting the wrong ones and there was actually an optimal route to avoid damage altogether, but nope. As soon as our voyage begins, before we're even given the opportunity to do anything, we take yet another 5d10 mandatory damage, with a roll of 29, for a total of 59 thus far. Yippee. Anyways, the main reason I wanted to rush here as quickly as possible is because it contains the encounter I am by far the most anxious of. If there's going to be any boss that would require multiple specialized characters to defeat, it was likely going to be this one. So I wanted to see how prepared Buge was, and if it was even remotely feasible for him to solo the encounter given the circumstances. Fortunately, getting there is actually fairly easy. There isn't much stopping us from simply sneaking past most of the demons patrolling the mines, Then we can pass an intimidation check in order to avoid having to fight Mutasafin for his key. And afterwards, all we have to do is kill these 2 low-level, no-name bodyguards, and we can begin the fight against Tepsamira, who is a complete pushover. To be fair, if she ever reached melee range, she was fairly likely to hit us. A base attack bonus of 68 is fucking insane, but if is the key word there. Really, as long as we win the initiative roll, we were going to win the encounter. But once we deal enough damage, she uses her last remaining strength to summon the Demon Lord Baphomet himself, and let me tell you, this dude is a menace to society. He starts the encounter off by dispelling all of your buffs, which is severely problematic in of itself. Then he usually follows that up with a baleful polymorph that is extremely difficult to resist, and all but secures your death if you don't make the save, before he fucking blasts you with volleys of high-level spells every single turn. This is a fight you're not supposed to win. Of course it is totally possible to defeat him, and the game even accounts for that, but I was uncertain if I could even survive this encounter, much less win with no damage taken. And at first, things seemed pretty grim. Preparation proved to be futile due to the previously mentioned dispelling, and our usual hit-and-run strategies are all but worthless against him with no place to run and no place to hide. It was a complete death march, and one that was proven to be far worse than I could have ever anticipated. But then, I realized something. I received clairvoyance. I knew what I had to do. It was so obvious. It was at my side all along. My true mentor. And hey, would you look at that? Mythic 7. Favored Metamagic Extend is an odd choice at first glance, but it makes sense when you realize just how many spell slots we have dedicated to extended buffs. If you look at our 7th level spells, for example, those are almost exclusively 6th level buffs extended to 24 hours. But with this, we've effectively doubled our available Feasts of Blood, which is now dealing a casual 31d6 damage, never mind the potential to make that even more lethal with the roughly 8 billion metamagic rods we've been collecting throughout the act. And another thing this allows us to do is to extend 9th level spells, which in this case is primarily going to be Selective Domain of the Hungry Flesh. If you thought this spell was bordering on unfair already, its duration just shot up from a considerable 31 rounds of damage to a pretty considerable 14,000. No, it's not a typo, it's just a thing we can do now. To be fair, this has been possible ever since we hit Mythic 6, but without Selective, it'd only really be usable as an absolute last resort since we'd effectively remove an area from existence for an entire day. Although, in retrospect, if Magic Nullification wasn't available for Baphomet, I wouldn't be surprised if this would have been the answer for his boss fight. Before moving on from our new mythic ability though, one last spell I wanted to mention was Negative Eruption, which now gives us an effectively permanent +2 bonus to attack and damage rolls. Nothing too exceptional by itself, but it's still pretty nice, and is worth a spell slot in my opinion. And after I spent an honestly uncomfortable amount of time perfectly organizing my spellbook, before returning to Dresden, we took a slight detour to kill the Scorcher of Souls as he was guarding the final portal that spawns from the inevitable darkness. Which in this case was a Flawless Headband of Mental Perfection +8 and a Flawless Cloak of Resistance +7. Both of which are pretty damn good. Unfortunately, the secondary passives were mostly redundant because of Blessing of One Life, but honestly the raw numbers were so good that I decided to throw them all on anyway. It's a good problem to have, but having to gear up only one character results in us frequently cycling through multiple best-in-slot contenders, but that may not be an issue for too much longer. Because after, I'd say all this time, but really this was the fastest act by far, we finally returned to Dresden, Listen, I know we've been a Lich the entire playthrough, and I was leading you on by rather directly implying that we were gonna go all in as a Mythic Lich. But if you thought there was a chance in hell I was gonna make a Wrath of the Righteous video and not go for the Swarm that walks, you do not know me. Now, to answer your questions in order, is this optimal? Quick answer, no. We lose out on all of our Lich powers save the Merge Spellbook, our extra Lich caster levels, including Dark Rites, which by proxy means no more 24-hour round per level spells, all of our remaining companions, as well as all of our mercs, all of their respective quests and rewards, the entire Crusade system, which by proxy means no Act 5 relics and no secret ending, most merchants, and of course about a dozen or so best-in-slot items. And mechanically, the gains are dubious at best, all but requiring you to grind in order to even remotely compare to the other mythic paths. There's a good reason why the Swarm that walks is frequently referred to as a challenge run. If your build is not extremely self-sufficient, the Swarm can quickly become a fail state unless you decide to play the game like a Korean MMO. Oh yeah, and speaking of which, even the very notion of picking this path is a fail state because Iomedae herself smites us from the heavens to try and prevent us from taking form. However, as someone who has had to watch their damage taken like a hawk throughout the entire playthrough, I am here to tell you why this goddess is a fake. Firstly, this damage is also self-inflicted, meaning that Iomedae did no damage to us, we did damage to us. Duh. But even assuming that the damage wasn't friendly fire, it'd still be pretty humiliating. You wanna know why? This number is photoshopped. She didn't do thousands of damage. I lied to you. Iomedae, the goddess of righteousness herself, calling upon a storm of holy fire to smite down an existential threat born from endless hunger and the hatred of all things, dealt an entire, history-defining, earth-shattering 8 damage. She dealt 8 damage. Okay, honestly, it makes sense we're on Crusade number 5 now, especially with Galfrey at the helm. If you think about it, the Swarm that walks is actually a mercy killing. Anyways, let's get into the mechanics of our Swarm. Firstly, Swarm clones. Although I don't quite fully agree with the sentiment, many people would claim that on Unfair, your party's just your main character's entourage. But admittedly, that opinion isn't baseless. Statistically, the buffs provided by your Mythic Path will far exceed what your companions are capable of without them. And considering that your party is likely going to have at least 2 support-oriented characters since buffs are so highly sought after, it isn't strictly uncommon for a Knight Commander to deal upwards of 60 to 70% of your party's overall damage. However, your Swarm clones do not share that weakness. They are clones in the most literal of senses. Everything your main character has unlocked, they'll have unlocked. All of your stats, skills, abilities, mythic abilities, feats, mythic feats, spells, personal buffs. The only thing that doesn't carry over is your inventory. But besides the fact that your Swarm clones are extremely efficient and aren't very dependent on gear to function, even that has some exploits available that no other Mythic Path has access to. So having multiple Buges online is effectively pure upside, and hence we're going to want to unlock them as quickly as possible. Currently at Mythic 8, we're capped to a maximum of 1 Swarm clone, but we're going to go ahead and rush Mythic 9 because the power spike offered by it is insane. And fortunately getting there is fairly simple. Many people have reported having issues with the Rasping Rifts. Again, I'd imagine because being thrust into a solo run without preparing your entire character around that possibility is extremely painful. But that isn't a concern for us, and Shrouded Step is still the MVP of the playthrough as it allows us to skip straight to the final boss of the area, the Echo of Descari. He didn't really stand a chance, falling victim to the domain of the Hungry Flesh just like so many bosses before him. Even if he wasn't a complete idiot though, his movement speed is so low that he'd never be able to land an attack as long as we used up all of our movement on any given turn, and seeing as we already have access to a permanent damage over time effect via Swarm Infest, the poor bastard was always destined to be devoured by the Swarm. But moving on to our newly unlocked mythic feats, I forgot to mention it earlier, but for Mythic 8, I chose Schoolmaster and Necromancy for fairly obvious reasons. But upon reaching Mythic 9, I picked up yet another favored meta magic. This time bolstered to buff up our roughly 800 Exsanguinates, Feasts of Blood, and even a few negative eruptions. But more importantly, Mythic 9 unlocks the one thing that makes the Swarm that walks a remotely viable path. Infinite scaling. We did have some of this already, with Swarm Feast offering an additional 1d6 damage every turn in relation to your swarm size, as well as Swarm Form offering scaling DR and natural armor, which is incredibly valuable and will be utilized. But at Mythic 9, our newly unlocked Eye of the Swarm passive gives us scaling strength and dexterity, which in tandem with the new buff to Swarm Feast that gives all of our melee attacks a range of 50 feet that also targets enemies' touch AC, means that we're going to be sniping fuckers from across the map with a Great Axe that ignores most enemies' AC with perpetually increasing damage output. Yeah, I'm pretty happy about that. Never mind the fact that Swarm Feast's damage in of itself is honestly insane, and trust me, we will be abusing it. But all this talk about infinite scaling with swarm size and swarm clones and the Eye of the Swarm may have you thinking to yourself, Davey, what the fuck are you even talking about? Well, every time you kill an enemy, you're given the opportunity to devour them to increase the capacity of your swarm, and it's really slow. What most people do here is farm random encounters, which is as tedious as it is dreadfully boring. To be fair, it'd be far from the first challenge on the channel that would require us to commit to a painful, mind-numbing grind, but it would still take us literal days to get even remotely close to the power offered by the other mythic paths. Which, as an aside, in regards to mechanical output, I actually believe Legend would be the best option for Act 5. Of course, we'd be limited to only 2 mythic powers afterwards, so without the ability to respec, in order to pursue that, we'd have to replay the entire game from the end of Act 1, as we'd really like to have enduring and greater enduring spells available to maintain permanent self-buffs, which is available, as you can get up to caster level 40 with prestige classes, but honestly, considering the fact that we actually never utilized all of our levels granted by the other until the end of Act 2 anyways, that isn't particularly damning. But the thing that makes Merged Legends genuinely oppressive compared to the other paths is that they can regain their mythic 10th level spells, which is incredibly powerful as Angel, but genuinely game-breaking as Lich because Absolute Death is the very best fuck you, I win button in the entire game. The spell more or less reads, if your target fails a single saving throw, they die. Full stop. And with all the extra levels you unlock, even without the assistance of other party members, you can buff the difficulty class of the spell to such a ludicrous degree that you can one-shot any boss in the game, including the final boss, with 100% certainty. Yeah, being able to spam that against any vaguely threatening enemy we come across is actually gross. However, counterpoint. For as much as I love the indomitable human spirit, Legend is not a sentient, all-consuming swarm, so overall, I'm still pretty content with my decision. Admittedly, I'm not as content about the grinding requirement though, so we're going to pursue an alternative solution to that problem. We're going to automate the grind. Not by cheats, but by abusing what some would consider to be the worst area in the game. Blackwater. If I was ever declared President of the United States of America, I'd probably kill myself. Whether or not my suicide would be voluntary is a different question entirely, but if I had to live to see the term through, My first order of business would be to ban Kickstarter backer goals for RPGs. I'm sorry, but they're just never okay, never mind, I lied, they can stick around. Blackwater is great. I've never had a problem here before. In all seriousness though, Blackwater shouldn't really be a problem for anyone in Act 5. That isn't to say that its ill reputation isn't well deserved. Besides maybe the Midnight Fane, this is easily the hardest area in Act 3, but unlike the Midnight Fane, that is blatantly a point of no return, you're free to explore here from the very beginning of the act. And the inability to leave without passing a fairly difficult check, in tandem with exceptionally punishing mechanics that aren't tutorialized to newer players very well, makes this area extremely controversial. However, by this point in the game, you should have more than enough tools at your disposal to trivialize the combat encounters here, so things were a lot smoother than you may have anticipated. And eventually our swarm grew enough that we were able to spawn in our first Buge clone, and after we got all of his gear, spells, and hotbars set up, we could shroud step straight to the end of this hellscape to fight the boss, the creatively named 100 Face. 100 Face's boss fight has infinitely respawning ads. I think you can see where I'm going with this. Now, if we go directly into the center of the room, we're going to take damage. Although they are exceptionally rare with Protective Luck back online, the occasional critical hit from the Incubi and Succubi does completely dismiss the possibility of this being an AFK farm. However, if we shimmy our Buges tightly enough into this corner, just to the right of the entrance, we're able to get into a position where Swarm Feast only pulls Clavicus, or Clavici, cows, on a trash farm. And cows cannot deal damage to us. Their only attack is a claw that cannot bypass our swarm immunities, so now all we have to do is set coup de grace on autocast and do literally anything else while our Buges scale into infinity. That being said, I decided to call this quits fairly early on because there is another farm available that's even easier and gives us even more swarm per minute. However, it does require a clone in order to function, hence why I decided to prioritize Blackwater first. So, as a baseline, I believe the cow farm was about 30 swarm a minute, which, for something that is entirely AFK, isn't bad at all. However, if we return to our favorite DLC, the Midnight Isles, the first island has 2 undertows, which, in case I never mentioned them, are occasional modifiers to make each individual island feel more unique. And the second undertow can be problematic for us as it forces us to take damage anytime we fail a save, but unlike most others, it can be dispelled, so magic nullification somehow proves to be the MVP yet again. The first one, however, is much more important though. Every time we cast a spell, we summon a dorky little baby dragon that's just a piece of shit. Just like the cows, they are entirely unable to damage us due to swarm immunities, but unlike the cows, they are extremely squishy and we can force them to spawn much faster. If we set Buge to auto-cast a cantrip, in this case Touch Fatigue, we can spawn into Spell Munchers every 6 seconds. And for reasons unknown to man, those Spell Munchers actually give us more swarm per kill than the previous farm. So by intentionally placing our main Buge in a corner to spam Touch Fatigue, and placing our secondary Buge just far enough away for Swarm Feast to devour any excess Spell Munchers, while ensuring enough survive to continue spamming Fatigue, we get about 200 to 300 swarm per minute, which is actually fucking stupid. So we started this farm at about 1200, and if you notice the number next to it, that's the variable for all of our swarm's infinite scaling. For example, at our current swarm of 4, we get an extra 4 dexterity and 4 strength. The amount of swarm required to increase our swarm size increases by 100 every level. So, for example, we hit level 1 at 100, level 2 at 300, 3 at 600, 4 at 1000, and so on and so forth. And after leaving my PC on overnight to grind out these stupid little dragons, I woke up to a casual swarm count of 130,000. That is an extra 50 dexterity and 50 strength. And with Swarm form, that's a casual 50 additional AC, damage negation, and damage on hit, which is utterly absurd in of itself. But with Swarm Feast, we also deal 54 d6 physical damage in a wide area every turn. Yeah, Iz never stood a fucking chance. Nothing survived Buge's rampage. Not the demons, not the Crusaders, not even Discari himself. And funnily enough, this is going to be the second Demon Lord we're going to kill by doing absolutely nothing. I mean, you'd expect the Demon Lord of Locusts to figure out why he was taking hundreds of damage every single turn for seemingly no reason, but all things considered, I really cannot complain too much about that. Ironically, the one and only complication that arose was after Discari's defeat where we leave the city for Dresden, because the weather alternates to a perpetual storm of blood, complete with blood lightning, that can in fact damage you, including while you're in cutscenes, which was really fucking annoying. But after a few reloads, we were able to rush out of the unholy city, unfortunately not entirely unscathed as there was another 1d6 mandatory damage, rolling a 5 for a total of 72. Then we can return to Dresden, devour the last remnants of this pitiful excuse of a crusade, and promptly get an invitation to a celebration in Canabris. Yay! So this is the quest to begin A Dance of Masks, which is actually a really cute little DLC. I understand that it wouldn't translate well to every game, but I do think more RPGs should embrace post-launch content like this to serve as a final farewell to the companions you've grown attached to, and to thank you for all the great memories you've shared together. It is surprisingly wholesome. That is, if you play the DLC as literally anything else other than the Swarm. As the Swarm, all of your companions have already abandoned you. In fact, there's a very high chance that you've eaten all of them in retaliation by the time you've received an invitation. So since the DLC doesn't really function without companions, it suddenly warps into this absolute massacre where you are effectively the main antagonist, and it is incredibly enjoyable. I mean, check this shit out. I don't know what the fuck is happening here, but I'm having a great time. Also, cool little fun fact while we're here, completing this DLC as the Swarm is actually the rarest achievement in the game. So now I have a break glass in case of emergency button in case I desperately need a clickbait thumbnail to raise viewership. But I digress. Back to meta progression, you may have noticed that we haven't had our third Buge with us for a while, and although this was completely unnecessary, there's a reason why. After we finished what Discari started all the way back in Act 1, we're abducted by Razmir, who is an incredibly fun villain. Just an absolute bastard in the best way possible. But following a nice little talk, we're abducted to Razmir's palace, and after a quick storybook event where we obtain a small glimpse of freedom, we're given the opportunity to explore it in all of its glory. More specifically, lack thereof. And hidden within this alcove is a Tome of Ancient Perfection, a book that gives us a +4 inherent bonus to all of our attributes, which of course will carry over to any of our future Buges. Like I said, min-maxing this was completely and totally superficial, but since we wanted to get here ASAP anyways, I figured it was worth the very minor inconvenience to boost up our tertiary Buge. But while we're talking about valuable items, there's one weapon in particular here that is so immensely valuable that it completely warped how I would normally play through Act 5 and led to me rushing to Razmir's palace as quickly as possible. The Sin Mage's Staff. Surprisingly, the effect is fairly basic. This is a staff that gives us an extra +3 caster levels, which in of itself is super generically strong, but isn't really powerful enough to make its acquisition our highest priority. But let me remind you, we also have the Robe of Transmutation, which does the same thing. And these two stack. Permanent 1 round per level spells are back on the menu, and we're gonna make it everyone else's problem. With 3 Buges, all attacking 5 times a turn, with ranged melee weapons that also target touch AC, with infinite scaling damage. Yeah, Razmir could never hope to contain this horde of pestilence and destruction. Despite his best efforts, what transpired could only be considered a massacre. But to reward us for the inconvenience, we were offered Razmir's Ring as a consolation gift, which is going to be one of our best in slot items, as it gives you a +8 enhancement bonus to all of your spellcasting stats, the same as the Flawless Headband of Mental Perfection, but while that has a fairly redundant secondary passive thanks to Blessing of Unlife, Razmir's Ring makes it so that all of your spells are intensified and maximized, which is insanely powerful. I feel the need to point out that on top of our absurd single target damage, our AoE is also nothing short of game-breaking with a respectable 162 d6 damage every single turn via Swarm Feast. And just in case anything ever had a chance of surviving that, you also have to remember that we're a party of 3 high-level, fully geared spellcasters with literal dozens of high-level AoE spells each. We're playing motherfucking Rocket Tag while also having enough AC that nothing in the game can hit us in melee without critting, Protective Luck to make those crits even less probable, never mind our inability to be caught flat-footed, all of our swarm immunities that entirely mitigate most melee weapons, a flat 50% dodge chance against all ranged attacks, as well as an absurd amount of passive damage reduction, while also being immune to most status conditions, most elemental damage, and if need be, immunity to most spells outright without sacrificing too much power thanks to innate scaling, while of course having some of the highest mobility in the game with infinite teleports, invisibility, and 4 times movement speed. You know, just in case something thought they could ever catch up to us while we sniped them from 50 feet away with a fucking scythe. This isn't really unfair for me, this is just unfair to the game at this point. So we're gonna try and fight every optional Act 5 boss we can, just to see how trivial they've all become. So our first priority is gonna be finally conquering the Midnight Isles, and... Okay, so what I said about difficulty holds true for like 95% of the game, but I kind of have to immediately rescind my previous statement because the bullshittery this DLC begins to throw at you is immense. Honestly, the best way I can describe it is that basically every other room is positioned as a gang fight. There's about 20 billion traps and environmental hazards, most of which bypass all of our immunities, and to follow that up, there's another trillion spellcasters that similarly bypass all of our resistances and immunities for guaranteed damage. The overwhelming majority of which are also fucking invisible, and spread out in such a way that you will only notice them when it's way too late. Hell, there's even quite a few enemies that can damage you by simply hitting them. And to be fair, that can be dispelled, but altogether, anything resembling an aggressive or proactive playstyle is completely unviable. Which means that the best strategy to reach the end of the Midnight Isles is to play as passively as possible, carefully inching our way through every corridor until we notice our swarm chewing something apart, AFKing until the combat log notifies us of their death, and rinsing and repeating until the inevitable heat death of the universe. Was this fun? No. Would have preferred to whack everything instead? Yeah. But this is the hand we're dealt, so we're gonna do what we can with it. Fortunately, we did get one piece of incredible loot by the end, though. The Mutilated Angel. Which is one of the best melee weapons in the game, full stop. Against most enemies, it has an incredible +5 attack roll bonus, deals an extra 1d12 on hit, and also inflicts a stacking AC debuff. Altogether, it's a great endgame weapon, and is one that I'm very happy to have access to in my armory. But afterwards, we do get a nice opportunity to help buff up our second Buge. While Buge 1 and Buge 3 both have a +4 inherent bonus to all stats via the Tome of Ancient Perfection, Buge 2 unfortunately missed out on that train, so anytime we find a book or potion that increases stats, we're going to want to funnel it into him whenever possible. And after we kill the Songbird, we're given the opportunity to chat to this Nahindri fellow, forcing him to relive all of his painful memories before politely informing him, "Do you know what I think about all this? You're a little bitch." Surprisingly, he doesn't take too kindly to that and attempts to fight us. And this is actually a pretty difficult fight, as he summons 3 of the toughest bosses we've had to face on this island adventure. But we were blatantly overstated for this encounter, so we were able to quickly dispatch them and summarily defeat him. Well, quickly is relative. The dude does have a ton of damage reduction and literal thousands of health after all, but still. Wasn't too bad. Anyways, after defeating him, we gain access to a fairly decent longsword, although one that unfortunately finds itself competing against some of the best weapons in the game, as well as several tomes to boost up Buge 2's stats, which I do appreciate. Anyways, we're then given the opportunity to fight Nahindri himself, and despite what you may expect considering my grievances with the Midnight Isles in this act, it's actually a really fun fight mechanically. I had a few paragraphs here describing the mechanics in depth, but for some reason the boss fight just crashed every time I tried to engage with it on this save, so let's go ahead and skip over to the obvious joke. Bizarrely, this wasn't effective at all against his shadow. That only took a single damage every turn, so it was largely non-viable. But this absolute unit seemed to miss the memo, so that's another mechanically challenging boss down for the count. And following this, I think it's appropriate to continue our streak of killing demon lords by doing absolutely nothing. So it's time for the most fun quest in the game. Before we even have the opportunity to fight Ereshkigal, we need to find 4 hidden masks. The first of which we already found in the Ivory Sanctum, but the remaining 3 are scattered throughout Act 5 exclusive areas. Firstly, in Poora's Fall, after doing a quick puzzle, we can unlock an alcove that contains the second mask, as well as another tome to increase Buge 2's intelligence and a decently powerful ring. Secondly, we have to reach the Ineluctable Prison, which has the potential to be absolutely miserable. Telling you from experience here, I had a practice run that was forced to soft reset here for literally an hour and a half, specifically because there's a cutscene where you're forced to take 12d8 slashing damage, and although we can mitigate the damage via Swarm Form, even with pretty solid damage reduction, with 3 Buges all having to pass the check, RNG can still readily fuck us to death here. Fortunately, Karma decided I shouldn't have to endure that pain again, and I was able to bypass this nonsense in only 3 attempts, and I sincerely cannot portray in words how thankful I was for that divine blessing. And following that intervention, the next mask is super easy to acquire from here. But while we're here, we may as well do everything we can. Firstly, the Ashen Lady. She is our first, and unfortunately not last, properly impossible enemy. Before you're given the opportunity to fight her, she always deals 1d6 plus 5 unholy damage, and I don't believe there's a way to actually resist unholy, so it's not happening. Then we were able to get the Dawnflower's Kiss. And unfortunately, as much as I really wanted to use the evil option here, as it's very in line with Buge's character, especially considering his previous choice of Mythic Path, that results in yet another powerful weapon that is entirely unusable as it deals damage to the wielder on hit. So we're going to be nice for once and get an actually decent weapon instead. Secondly, Alderpash. Or Elderpash. Alderpash? This dude was a fucking asshole. He's another enemy that I couldn't attack thanks to his Vampiric Shadow Shield, which always deals at least 2 damage every time he's attacked. But fortunately we can dispel it, so on our second attempt, Corrupt Magic annihilated the poor bastard, and we were well on our way. Wait, sorry, hold on a second. I'm looking at the wiki, because I want to talk about the cape you get, which is really good, but then I realized if you talk to Elderpash, then go talk to Baphomet, there's I am my scars as a dialogue option. It's fucking incredible. Back to the bosses though. Thirdly, the Father of Worms. Fortunately, this fight went off without a hitch. I legitimately could not tell you if he had any mechanical depth or complexity because he died before I could notice otherwise. Then finally, my poor, sweet summer child, Inheribro. I love this dude. I've stated this before, but I fucking love paladins and crusaders in fiction. To be abundantly clear, I'm not the type of chronically online Twitter addict who barges into conversations entirely unprompted, spamming the same 3 unfunny Astartes gifs while screeching Deus Vult in hell we need another holy crusade against the enemies of Christ, while never doing anything that even remotely resembles the Lord's teachings. But if you give me the opportunity to play as an immortal, walking tank to serve as the vanguard for a righteous cause they've devoted their life to, I'm going to take it. And for that exact reason, Inheribro really resonates with me. He is easily the best part of any good aligned playthrough, and being forced to kill him in evil aligned playthroughs always inflict severe emotional damage to me. Admittedly, that reluctance was short-lived though, because god damn it, he's yet another enemy we can't attack. And this time, it's not even from a dispellable source either. So we were forced to fight this man like a demon lord. Albeit a demon lord that also required us to assign a tank to maintain aggro, so slightly more complicated, but not by much. At least that's what I thought until I discovered that the Hand of the Inheritor is actually a reverse sea bear and cannot escape from his designated circle. I'm not totally certain why, but the mental image of Baphomet... Oh, this is a really unfortunate typo. I wanted to do grounding the Hand of the Inheritor, but there's grinding. I don't think I want that mental image. Lots of off-script moments today. After we consume what remains of him for the Swarm, we can leave the ineluctable prison behind us for a brighter tomorrow. Well, not too much brighter, actually, because we're still on our mask quest, and the good news is that our final mask isn't locked behind any encounters. We can just run in, grab it, and leave. The bad news is that we now have all the masks, and this is where I have to be exceptionally rude. For the longest time, Owlcat was absolutely infatuated with shoving an honestly uncomfortable amount of dogshit puzzles into their games. To make my controversial political stance known, I do believe puzzles have their place in CRPGs. I think they're incredibly valuable if they're used as a vehicle to reward exploration, to incentivize interacting with the environment, and or to serve as an alternative non-combat solution. But I think it is more or less universally agreed upon that the game went way too fucking far with its puzzles. Like, I've seen a lot of takes about this game over the years, most of which I can totally understand and even agree with, but usually there's a bit of a back and forth whenever the most common points are brought up. Something like, yeah, encounter design definitely suffers from being less thoughtful and deliberate, but the sheer amount of build diversity and player choice makes the game extremely replayable, so I think it's a worthy trade-off. But over all of these years, I have never heard anyone say, yeah, I actually really like the puzzles in Pathfinder. Yet, they kept showing up, and every time they appeared, they became increasingly bizarre and illogical, and the enigma is that tendency taken to its most extreme. Which honestly sucks, because if you can overlook that flaw, I think this dungeon is actually great. It is impossible to ignore the fact that it is buried underneath 7 quadrillion puzzles, though. And they mostly suck. Even with a step-by-step guide, you're in for at least an hour or two of pure tedium and inevitable confusion when you have to backtrack to see what step you missed or otherwise forgot. The only thing I liked about having to revisit this area is, bizarrely, Discari. I didn't mention this because it was never particularly relevant, but after defeating his Echo in the Rasping Rifts, you're given the opportunity to sever the connection you've shared after your mythic transformation, and I think anyone who does that is doing themselves a massive disservice. The dude is actually hysterical. You have no clue when he's going to appear in dialogue or what he's going to say, but every time you see his dumb little portrait pop up, you know he's about to say something incredibly based. And he's quite possibly at his best here. Initially, he's very dismissive, informing you that there's nothing of value to be earned within this hellscape, and almost demanding you to turn around. But once it's apparent that you're committed to conquering the Enigma, he just starts bickering with Reshkagal, who's constantly attempting to provoke existential dread within him due to his very nature as the host of an all-devouring swarm. And his carefully constructed rebuttal to all this philosophical bullshit is, I have a really big scythe that I'm going to kill you with. And you know what? I am all for that energy. So, thanks for being a beacon of light in this dark abyss, Discari. I love you lots. But after 2 hours of agony, we're able to finally fight Reshkagal, and she is objectively a demon. I wonder what the strategy to defeat her is gonna be. Alright, so there's only 4 left now. 3 of which we unfortunately can't fight, as they're exclusive to specific paths or endings. That being Nocticula, found in both the Trickster and Demon paths, Sokoth Banoth in the Trickster path, and a rematch against Baphomet before the secret ending. But for funsies, I decided to spawn them in via console commands, and I can confirm we were able to eat them up fairly easily. Then there's Sithhood, even if he technically isn't a full Demon Lord. Fortunately, the fight itself was very easy. There's an alcove over here where none of his attacks can actually hit us, so we're safe to whittle him away entirely uncompromised. There was a problem we needed to solve, though. This dude has a phase transition that activates upon hitting a certain health threshold, which of course means we need to have Swarm Feast active, but the phase transition also damages us, which means we have to have Swarm Form active, so tragically defeating him while doing absolutely nothing seems to be off the table. At least that's what I thought, because for some reason he is allergic to quick saving. If you quick save when he's at low enough health, he just instantaneously perishes. Again, I don't know how or why, but I'm not complaining. But then we have another problem. We have to survive the fall without taking damage. And at first I was gearing up for this to be a repeat of the Ineluctable Prison, because I was getting attempts where Buge was only taking about 6 to 8 damage. But after about 30 minutes of this, I was beginning to doubt if this was actually possible, because I always took at least some damage, and after cheating in a casual 500 swarm size for an extra 500 damage reduction, I quickly confirmed that you're always taking at least 4 damage here, and unfortunately the damage taken isn't logged, so we can't even figure out what type of damage we're getting hit by to try and remedy it. However, the first thing I tested was to see if being incorporeal prevented the damage, and surprisingly it did. However, we do not have access to a spell or buff that makes us incorporeal. I believe there's only about 9 or 10 sources of it in the entire game, and none of them would work here. I mean, if Unfair allowed respecs, sure, but all of them either require heavy investment into a specific class, Mythic Path, have an extremely low duration, and or require specific conditions to be met. So we're going to chalk this one up to being an unfair Mythic skill issue. It's possible, just not with our current build. But while we're on the topic of disappointment, let's go ahead and discuss the last thoroughly impossible encounter. So, one thing missing from Swarm's Dance and Masks experience is the Echo of Fury Arena. This is a fun gauntlet made to test endgame builds, and I like it a lot. However, you usually enter the arena in the middle of the festivities, which of course, were entirely absent in this playthrough for some reason. But fortunately, we'll regain access to it in Dresden after enough time passes, and I was having a great time going through it all again. There's over 15 unique endgame encounters, and having a dedicated arena to utterly unleash builds upon is always going to be enjoyable. I mean, look at how diabolical the arena's condition is. I was having a great time. That was, until we get to the final encounter against this asshole, who has the ability to cast a death curse. Once he hits 0 health, he curses the enemy that dealt the killing blow, and after a short duration, he deals 1,000 damage and re-emerges from the host to continue the fight. Firstly, this cannot be dispelled. I tried every spell, scroll, and potion I could think of, even including magic nullification, and just to be thorough, I even digged for the properties of it to confirm that it does in fact have the is not dispellable tag, so that isn't happening. Then, of course, the second thing I tested is, what if something else deals the killing blow? So I nearly burned down my house trying to see if we could use summons, but nope, that doesn't work either, which is fair enough, I suppose. Then, I had an epiphany. An idea that should be foolproof. It is time to release the Bismuth. An animal companion normally wouldn't be able to bypass the curse. They would always be doomed to perish. However, this is the only animal companion that we can effectively dismiss. So the game plan is simple. Super buff Bismuth, lower Dreamo's HP to critical levels, let our Cretaceous bully charge into the fray for the killing blow, and then promptly remove him from our inventory. Doing this, we should be able to entirely bypass the curse and claim victory over the Echo of Fury. And I will be the first to admit, when he pulled it off, I audibly cheered for him. Bismuth is an absolute champion in any playthrough, and I was so happy that he finally got the recognition he deserved in this video. Until my hopes and dreams were abruptly shattered. The curse cannot mark an animal companion, it always has to be a party member. So, this is impossible. There is no way to mitigate the damage. If you wanted to twist the rules a little bit, you can survive with Last Stand, but even if you were to theoretically have a level 1 mercenary with only 1 HP take effectively 0 damage from the curse, the damage still counts against you in the character stat screen. Hell, there's even a weird glitch where the damage will remain even if you reload a previous save, so for this video, it's a wipe. Which does kinda suck because Debracers of Slaughter is one of the very best items in the game, but honestly I can't be too upset about it. If anything, I'm glad the final optional challenge offered in the final DLC of the game was where we hit a wall and not some shenaniganizer like a random no-name demon in a mandatory quest. Oh well. At least I can take a quick detour to the giant foreboding ziggurat I constructed in the center of town and vent out my frustrations on Zacharias for being a dick. I understand that's the entire point of the character, but he is easily the worst part of any Lich playthrough. Me and my homies fucking hate Zacharias. Let's go ahead and beat the game, I guess. So, remember when I said way earlier that the difficulty generally tapers off in the mid to late game? I love the rationale for Rowdy Dip just to make Act 1 and 2 infinitely easier at the trade-off of a slightly worse level 20 character, or the magic nullification cheese making Act 2 and 3 easier at the trade-off of delayed mythic progression. I think the developers took that sentiment to heart because this is considered to be Act 6 of the game, and the enemies are actually psychotic. You can have a party that can blitz through Act 5 with minimal complications, only to completely fall apart in Act 6. It is so far beyond anything else that the game throws at you. I'm not kidding when I say that any individual enemy in Threshold could realistically be an immensely challenging boss in previous acts. They're infamous enough that people know the quote-unquote trash mobs by name. If you know the horror that is the desolating Galu Stormcaller, you know exactly what I mean. And Owlcat does not hesitate to have several enemies in every pack, with nearly 24 packs in total. A defensive play was all but required to defeat Real unscathed, which is mostly fine in the lead up to Threshold. The first battle is slightly claustrophobic, but after that the encounters aren't constricting at all, and you're generally free to take initiative and set the pace of every fight. In fact, there's an entire defensive segment located here with your B team of party members that never entered Threshold with you, and being able to bypass that entirely as a swarm is extremely convenient. But once we make it inside, that's when things get very messy. Unlike previous dungeons like the Ivory Sanctum, where we could take things very slow and steady, methodically eradicating all resistance while being able to readily disengage whenever you're under threat, Threshold is nowhere near as forgiving, and you can really tell by the footage that I was panicking the entire time. Every enemy is built like a killdozer, all the while having immense offensive pressure, and every battle taking place in narrow, winding corridors that are difficult to properly gauge thanks to the less than ideal architecture makes things incredibly chaotic. There were a lot of very close calls, yet despite the suboptimal play, we managed to miraculously travel into the demi-plane without a single reload, where fortunately we have access to such an absurd power spike that we'll be in great shape for the rest of the game. Of course, this conversation is where we get our very last mythic level, and Swarm debatably becomes the single most overpowered path here. At Mythic 10, we gain access to the Swarm, and just like Mythic 9 that offered scaling dexterity and strength, Mythic 10 now gives you scaling intelligence, wisdom, and charisma, which in of itself is basically GG, but what makes this insane is that we have access to not one, not two, but an extra 3 clones to decimate the game with. And after spending 20 minutes equipping our new acolytes with gear, fully kitting out their spellbook, taking a quick long rest, and performing our full buffing routine, nothing even stood a chance. I'd like to say that our power effectively doubled here, but mathematically the difference between having half a party and having a full party is so monumental that I'd wager it's closer to tripling than anything. It's difficult to really quantify, but against enemies that would previously force us to play defensively, we're able to dive in and tear them apart before they even get a chance to play the game, which is always nice. Honestly, it's a pretty good sign when the game is so laggy from having to render so many particle effects simultaneously. All things considered, I'm having a pretty great time here. And after a few more trash fights, as the Echo of Discari died long ago, it's time for the final boss. And it is brutal. Remember earlier when I was talking about how difficult Act 6 is compared to everything before it? Yeah, Arilu is yet another step up from Threshold. She is such an immensely punishing fight on Unfair that if your party isn't extremely well optimized, it can realistically become mathematically impossible. She's similar to Baphomet in that from the moment you start combat, you're going to abruptly get annihilated by about 7 million high-level spells every single turn. But unlike Baphomet, you have to be able to melt her down, and she does not make that easy. She has nearly 2,000 health, 104 AC, resistance and/or outright immunity to just about everything, all the while teleporting across the arena like a maniac in case you ever thought you could catch up to her. Fortunately, Corrupt Magic continues to be a menace and does help, but something I quickly learned is that she's yet another enemy that reflects damage upon getting attacked from a source that cannot be dispelled. So melee is out of the question. We're finishing the game with a full-on wizard duel. But you know what? That reminds me of something. And in a way, I think it's oddly poetic. From the very moment we first unlocked our mythic potential hidden deep within our soul, it manifested into something unorthodox. Something that most wouldn't ever consider. And after so many trials and so many sacrifices, when our very creator decides that we are a lost cause at the precipice of our victory, that very same power is what will turn the tide in our favor, and overcome the final obstacle that an entire century of Crusades could never achieve. And with that, I'm happy to report that, besides a few minor altercations with exclusively white women, come to think of it, we were kinda sorta able to beat Pathfinder Wrath of the Righteous without getting...
How dare you threaten me, mortal imitator? Do you truly believe you are capable of devouring the one known as the Usher of the Apocalypse? Enough! I will end you here and now, and then eternity awaits us.
Did you know that Niscari has a unique scythe that drops here? It's actually really good. If you can loot it before the end credits, it's probably one of the best melee weapons you can run in the Inevitable Access DLC. And I was considering including that in this video because getting the full party power spike for only a handful of encounters feels somewhat disappointing, but I think it would ultimately be more the same, but more puzzles. So, yeah. That's Wrath of the Righteous. And I am still bad at doing outros. If I'm being honest with you here, I just don't think I'm ever gonna be good at them, so... I'm just gonna go ahead and thank my YouTube members and patrons for enabling me to spend way too much time on dumb videos like these. At the time of recording, this list of somewhat confusing, but very charitable individuals include God Atlas, Obsidian Paladin, Lord Hath, Spookow, Zeralino, Luke GB, Seth Yarter 201, God Atlas again, Catherine, Nolan 46, Millennium, Rory of the Abyss, Preceptic, Basil V, Henry 30839, Tom B, The Muppet Guy, Mikolai, Morphus, Inferno Kieran, Lungulus, Blowhigh Enthusiast, Frank, Hannah K, Anon1, Wumpus, Teachy Boy, Darling Mim, Black Jade, Jacob S, Catapult Man 1, Teddy Bear Guy, MOS, and Blazeheart. As always, if you want to support the channel, links and relevant buttons will be down below, potentially even in the description. But, of course, as always, I have to include the mandatory disclaimer that the very act of even making this far is extremely supportive in of itself, so I wanted to thank you immensely for joining me on this bizarre adventure. Hopefully the next video won't take a casual 7 to 8 months to make. I've done an immense amount of recording and scripting, so I really hope it won't. It'd kind of be a failure on my part if it does, but anything's possible, I suppose. Could get hit by a tornado, or die. I mean, I don't think those are two mutually exclusive events, but still. I don't know. But always remember...
They choose to stand against me. I don't tolerate threats.